be one of the 20th century's greatest poets, as well as a central figure in English language modernism. His trials in language, writing style, and verse structure reinvigorated English poetry in the 20th century. He is also noted for his essays, which often reevaluated long-held cultural beliefs. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, to a prominent Boston Brahmin family, he moved to England in 1914 at the age of 25 and went on to settle, work, and marry there. He first attracted widespread attention for his poem The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1914, which at the time of its publication was considered outlandish. It was followed by The Wasteland in 1922, The Hollow Men in 1925, Ash Wednesday in 1930, and Four Quartets in 1943. He was awarded the 1948 Nobel Prize for his outstanding pioneer contribution to present-day poetry. So, Columba, welcome for the first time to this channel.
Yes, no, it's good to be here. I've been out of practice with my streaming for God. I mean, I can't even remember the last one I was on, so I might be a little rusty. But you drew me in with Eliot. I couldn't resist.
Well, I think it's just it was because we, just for context, Columba and I were both in London week before last, and that's kind of how it came about. We were talking a lot about Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and I just thought, well, why don't we do a ramble, basically, just on the subject for posterity. Before we get started, today is purely by coincidence something of an interesting day for contemporary British poetry, isn't it? Would you care to elucidate on why that is?
on the death of Mr. Zephaniah, do you mean?
Indeed.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a tragedy. The Bard of Brixton has left us.
Bard of Brixton.
But
yeah,
he wasn't. I think he turned down like his OBE and stuff like that as well, didn't he? Sort of made a show of.
Yes, he did. He remained, despite his apparent wealth, quite anti-establishment. Sorry, you cut out slightly there.
Yeah, I'm having you cut out slightly as well. We're being attacked.
Oh, this is it. They don't want us discussing high culture on YouTube. This isn't allowed.
Yeah, they do not allow. I'm checking my task manager. It's just Google Chrome just absolutely destroying me.
Oh dear.
Can I end this?
This is very boomery.
Well, like we say, I mean, poets are not built for this. This is not. I don't. There's all these things. I don't know what's going on here. What is Microsoft Office click to run? What? I hate the world.
Just while you're sorting that out, I just want to give people some context if they don't know who the late Benjamin Zephaniah actually was. I just want to say, obviously, this seems like a slightly insulting thing to bring up during what is supposed to be a stream among kind of literary reactionaries. But I can't really let it go without mention, because anybody who grew up in the United Kingdom over the past probably 20, 30 years would have basically been forced to read poetry by or inspired by the likes of Benjamin Zephaniah in school, in so-called literature classes. I mean, I always saw it as a bit of a joke. I mean, just for some background here, people understand what I'm talking about. Benjamin Obadiah Iqbal Zephaniah, 1958-2023.
Iqbal sounds like the name of some sort of evil Carthaginian commander.
Well, there's a very, very famous. Well, I would say Pakistani, but most of his life was spent before Pakistan became a country. Called Sir Mohammed Iqbal, who was knighted as a kind of. I mean, I don't speak any Eastern languages, so I can't tell you exactly how good his poetry is. But he does seem to have been genuinely a sort of skilled, I believe, Urdu language poet. So that's what I thought. But no. So there's at least two poets with the name Iqbal.
I'll tell you, it is really funny though, because I mean, you say people got Zephaniah in school, But I mean, maybe they did that because, obviously I'm Scottish. Up here, we didn't get the sort of the black poets. Instead, we got our own sort of parochial racial literature. Instead of people like that, we get Norman McCaig and the sort of the Scottish poets, which I suppose is sort of a very damning thing. We have our own sort
Are you
of
comparing
racial
Scots
struggle.
poetry to Zephaniah's?
Well, I mean, basically, it's not much more sophisticated. It is in many ways. I mean, well, I don't want to disparage people like McCaig or McDiarmid. I mean, I do think they were crackpots to some extent, but it's this whole thing of in the same way. Oh, if I write a poem in what Jamaican patois, even if the poem itself is nothing special at all, I'm sort of celebrating my culture, and it's the exact same thing in Scotland. It's I've written this poem in Scots, and even if the poem is absolute dross, we're meant to celebrate it because this is our heritage, our language, etc. So there is a sort of, again, like this strange parochialism in Scottish literature, which unfortunately is reflected in the black community in England, I think.
I mean, there does seem to be a sort of quite unfortunate complex in a lot of Scots cultural figures, where they have this kind of irritation with the dominance of English, which, I mean, here in Wales, that there isn't really such a kind of complex, because you really have all the Welsh who just speak English and the Welsh who write in Welsh, and the two communities are very much separate. I mean,
Well,
quite
you
a
see,
lot of sorry.
No, I think I think fundamentally they're misguided. I mean, even people like Hugh McDiarmid, who a lot of people might not have heard of today. His real name was Grieve, something Grieve. He was influenced by Eliot, by the Wasteland, things like that, and he sort of led a movement in Scotland in the 1920s, which gets called, as some French critic called it, the Scottish Renaissance. And the idea was, all right, Scottish poetry has been parochial for hundreds of years now. It's been sort of Robert Burns, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, and all that sort of stuff. It's like, how do we bring Scots poetry back and make it a respectable part of sort of European literature? But I mean, like you say, in Wales, you either write in English or you write in Welsh. But in Scotland, we have this weird situation where you have English, you have Gaelic in the north, and then you also have Scots, right? And then there's this idea that Scots can be used in the same way that you can use English. It has just as much of a capacity, but unfortunately, I mean, I think they were fundamentally misguided. I think this isn't true. I mean, as opposed to, I mean, I don't know the complexity or depth of Welsh or Gaelic. I don't know those languages, but Scots is fundamentally a sort of maybe in the days of Gavin Douglas in the 1500s, it had a certain complexity. But even then, if you read that language, poems from 1500s, 1400s in Scotland that are in Scots, supposedly, I mean, there's lots of Latin, French, and English words coming in even then. And fundamentally, the language is a sort of, I mean, it's not a language. You shouldn't call it language. Scots is a provincial version of English. Fundamentally, that's what it is. And so you can't expect this simple provincial language to be able to carry the same level of thoughts. And so when you read someone like Hugh McDiarmid, who his most famous poem, which again is taking the piss out of parochialism, it's called "A Drunk Man Looks at a Thistle." It is sort of inescapably artificial, and he can't help but chuck in Latin terms, English terms, because the language just doesn't have what he needs. He can't do what he wants it to do. But anyway, that's a sort of bit of an aside I've went into there. I digress.
I will just say I agree with what you're saying about Rose. What is it? A drunk man looks at the thistle. Though I have always quite liked it, because I love the drunken belligerence of it, because he wrote it at a time when he was so furious and so depressed at the kind of events of the 20s and the depression and the failure of the strike. And I read it long before I really knew what it was on about, but there's the line that's always stuck out to me is the "I saw a rose come looping out," because he's so just the belligerent imagery of the whole thing is quite fun.
He was a funny man, McDiarmid. I mean, I think he actually met. I don't know if he met Eliot. I know he met Pound once, apparently.
Yeah.
But
he also lived a long time. He
did. He lived into like the 70s or
long way out.
And he was a fascist and a communist and a Scottish nationalist at various points in his life.
He was kicked out of the Scottish nationalists for being a Marxist, and he was kicked out of the Marxists for being a Scottish nationalist. there weren't really many places for him, I don't think.
It is sad though, because I mean, as much as I think perhaps they were misguided, or maybe not. I mean, maybe they could do something with Scots, but I think it needed more work. I think it was sort of abortive. I mean, the real shame is that I think the goal was fundamentally a noble one. This idea of, bringing Scotland into the 20th century in terms of its literature. But unfortunately, I mean, now that idea is totally dead, I think. And the kind of Scots poetry today falls back on those same old things. You read people like Caroline Duffy and stuff like this. And,
oh God,
she will write these horrible poems about heather and moors and tartan and all these sorts of things. Or, I mean, the new version of Scots parochialism, I suppose, is you'll write a poem about, I don't know, like smack addicts and things like that. I mean, that's sort of our culture now. So
it's social realism, mate.
Social realism, mate. Aye. But I do think we've sort of fallen back into that parochialism. Only now, I mean, it's not even got the charm that it had in the the 18th, 19th centuries. Today, it's just this. It's the poetical equivalent of buying one of those Scotch bonnets from a tourist shop with the ginger hair on it. It's just
God,
I mean, quaint little silly thing.
If I could just sort of move all this back into one, I think that it all comes down to basically the cringe of progressives and liberals, because I mean, we mentioned this all started because we mentioned the death of Benjamin Zephaniah, who basically was lauded by people who really should have known better. And also, I should say, I mean, I know that a lot of the things he wrote and the influences he had are execrable. But it's I'm not doing this because of any real personal hatred towards the man, because really, I think the fault, as I said, lies at the feet of a lot of these kind of middle class. They would probably call themselves educators, who kind of get this kind of psychosexual joy out of putting someone like Zephaniah next to Keats or Southey or
absolutely, and
or any of these people.
You can't really blame him. I mean, at the end of the day, a man's got to eat. If you're a poet and people start offering you prizes and publications, I mean, you're going to go for it.
And he had them by the bucket load. I mean, because he perfectly exemplified. Or I mean, all of his coterie were extremely wealthy, upper middle class white liberals. I mean, he was the quote poet in residence at the barristers' chambers of Michael Mansfield, not Mansfield, sorry, Mansfield, who was one of these kind of crusading civil rights barristers, who just a constant kind of bleeding heart. And you really do get the sense that these people are somehow going through some form of repentance for their own internal problems, by kind of elevating all these sorts of people, or maybe they just get a kick out of throwing mud at the pantheon, as it were. Though, and again, the social realism that they attempt to do, which again, same thing in Wales. There's a certain ethos, or at least there was until fairly recently, when things have become a bit more kind of Faber and Faber kind of woolly countryside, if that makes sense, where you could only really be considered a serious writer in Wales if you talked about the, as you say, the drug problems and the Thatcherism and the post-industrialism and the housing, and
the mines,
like
the mines.
You weren't allowed to talk about anything else. Basically,
what was the disaster? Was it Aberfan or
Aberfan? Yeah,
yeah. I imagine you got a lot of poems out of that.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean that was such a genuinely shocking disaster.
Horrendous.
I mean, really, there was a kind of silence, because how do you answer that? You know, I mean, Aberfan, of course, in the news recently. We're in a because in a in a tiny Welsh town in the valleys, where pretty much the entire population of that town is native born. The one person who happened to be from Romania in that town brutally stabbed the pregnant woman on the street, and the
I mean,
media.
that's low, even for the Romanians. I mean, you know, the
I
Romanians that
mean,
I've met have been pretty decent people. I mean, I don't know where they found this fucking Wallachian animal. Like,
Columba says hashtag not all Romanians.
I absolutely do. I'm a staunch defender of the Romanian people.
Defending the
It's a
Romanians.
shame. It's a shame. I think in a way the Romanians were curtailed like my people. So I feel a bit of sympathy. I do. You know, you look at the
Listen to this.
Romanians
Third worldism. Third worldism. You're defending you're defending a fellow third world country. You're attacking a fellow third world country, Wales, which has been
by
savaged by one of your.
another third world country. But
You're standing with Romania against another Celtic nation. I think this is terrible. But
yeah.
right. Anyway, that is our preamble about
Yeah, this was
recent
meant to be
events.
about T.S. Eliot or
T.S.
something.
Eliot. Yeah, people are going to be furious. We're meant to be talking about Eliot. So right, I'll just ask you, kind of very very openly, what has been your kind of history of encounters with the work of T.S. Eliot, and have you had kind of a difference of opinion on him over the years? What of his works do you think deserves the most attention? You know, just tell me about your kind of broad view of him. So.
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say I've always known about T.S. Eliot. You know, I can't think of in my extreme youth reading him. I think I only started to read poetry seriously, I would say, in my mid-teens, about
Yeah.
16, 17, around that age. I mean, the first poem that I actually remember reading is Dante. I read all of Dante when I was 13.
Wow.
And I thought I was based and red pilled for that. I remember trying to explain to my friends that they should read this, and the blank stares. But anyway, I sort of then a couple, you know, I sort of read The Wasteland and stuff at that time, but I don't think it made much of an impression on me because I mean, yeah, I come from an uneducated family, and you know, I read that poem, and I read some of the other modernist works in my teens, and I didn't really get much from it. It wasn't as accessible to me as poetry in the classic style, I would say. I think something like Dante was more apt to appeal to my sort of mind that had been brought up on video games and violent films. If that makes sense, there was something more approachable about,
No,
you know, just
yeah,
a
that
straight
makes sense.
descent to hell. And then, I mean, first 2 years of university, I don't remember anything because I spent my entire time carousing.
You were drunk the entire time.
I literally was. I literally was.
Yeah,
But
you were part of Train Spotting. You were constantly just on smack and drunk. I mean,
yeah, well, we weren't that bad.
that's how Scottish people live. You know, we know
It's true.
this.
It's how we deal with the oppression.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, I'd say it was about end of second year, third year of university. I can't remember exactly why, but I bought copies of the sort of Faber editions of Eliot. I bought the copies of Pound, and I started just really getting into them and reading them exhaustively. And I think at the time, and for a number of years afterwards, I was more fascinated by Pound than I was by Eliot. And I would say a difference in opinion that I've had recently is, you know, I was apt to look at Eliot almost as a Swinburnian figure, in the sense that in a number of senses. Firstly, he was a critic as well, and Swinburne wrote some pretty excellent criticism in his day. And it's funny, there's sort of two different Swinburnes. If anyone doesn't know, this is Algernon Charles Swinburne, who was one of the great Victorian poets, and also a critic as well. And there's a sort of double personality in Swinburne, because you read his poetry and it's this sort of ecstatic classicizing stuff inspired by Sappho and all these sorts of things, so sort of decadent aesthetic style. And then you have some very, very lucid criticism. You know, you read his essays on Byron, for instance, and he actually makes a lot of points in his work on Byron that I think Eliot repeated. For instance, you know, I think it's Swinburne was one of the first people to say, you know, Byron isn't quotable. You can't appreciate Byron from a short piece of his work. You need to read Don Juan in the whole, because Byron's strength is narrative fundamentally. He's a storyteller. And I think Eliot makes similar points in his essay on Byron. I think he might actually mention Swinburne. So that's the first sort of similarity. They're critical minds. The second thing that got me, and this was a part of my sort of negative appraisal of T.S. Eliot, and to this day I still sort of wonder about this. You know, when I read Swinburne, you might agree, it's style over substance. Sometimes, you know, it's not that there's nothing there, but it sort of he joys in the rhetoric of the poetry, and the sort of mellifluousness of his words. And at times the actual sense is hidden, and you don't seem to be getting there doesn't seem to be meat behind it, for want of a better term. And sometimes with Eliot, reading him when I was younger, I think maybe this was just my lack of comprehension. I got that same feeling that sometimes Eliot is so taken up by his, and you know, this virtuoso ability to write this sort of you know, jazz, you know, music, this musical quality to his work that sometimes I think the meaning took a back seat. And I don't know if you've ever had similar impressions with Swinburne or Eliot, but this was my sort of opinion at the time. And I would say it's only recently, in the past year, I would say, if I'm being honest, maybe year and a half, you know, now that I'm out of university, when I've really been digging into these guys properly, reading the theory behind it, reading the works that they base their works on, that I think my opinion of Eliot is rising in proportion as that process is going on. But I do think that he does joy in the musicality. I'm not sure what you think of my rambling here. You probably disagree.
Well, no, it's very interesting. I was thinking about your point about Swinburne and his. I mean, style over substance is one way to put it. If you were being more generous, you might say he has a lyrical intensity. You know,
well, you could say the style is the substance.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I fundamentally have always been somebody who is very wowed by just kind of wordsmithing and wordplay.
Well, that's the Welshman in you.
That it is, I think. I mean, I was brought up on a colossal diet of nursery rhymes, which I mean, I remember very early on, I used to sit and just recite nursery rhymes to myself when I was a kid.
Which are, by the way, they're literally dying out. Nursery rhymes. It's sad as it sounds. Like, there's so many like little, I don't know, like sub-Zoomer children who have just literally never heard a nursery rhyme. You know, if you ask them,
oh no, no, they have they've heard an AI generated Indian YouTube channel sing Happy Birthday to them.
Yeah, whilst like Skibidi Toilet is on the
while their mum sits and, like, you know, texts men on Hinge or something, and they've just got an iPad in front of them. You know, that's modern parenting. That's what you get instead. But I mean, I've always had that love of just. I mean, even now there are poems I recite to myself a lot that have just gone into my head, and I really it sounds a bit embarrassing, but some of them I've never really stopped and considered the meaning. They just sound beautiful, you know. And I think with poetry, to an extent, that is half the battle, you know. I mean, there's a poem by Swinburne that I can remember most of, which is his Autumn and Winter. When he says, cold autumn, wan with wrath of wind and rain, saw pass a soul sweet as the sovereign tune that death smote silent when he smote again. You know, I mean, there's a certain, like, Victorian gildedness to that language And
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
There's
I
it's
agree.
sort of just sheer technical mastery, I suppose.
I mean, I agree with with a lot of the kind of new critics, you know, as Eliot kind of went on to lead that movement, that a lot of that Victoriana does have a sort of artificiality to it. But I also just love the cadences of the sounds and the fact that it is clearly so self consciously a work of just linguistic beauty on the ear. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, one of my very earliest poetic obsessions was Dylan Thomas. I mean,
Mhm.
I've been reading Dylan Thomas since I was about 13.
I've
But
not read nearly enough Thomas.
but
Not
I've
all.
only really started to grasp a lot of what he was talking about, you know, in the last 2 years. You know, just because the poems themselves, on the basic level, were enough for me. You know, I mean, there's a poem of his that begins, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." I mean, that that is a poem in itself. Just that
Mm.
line. I mean, again, that lyrical intensity, and you know, there are critics of him who say, "Well, he was just drunk on one word play," and it's like, yes, but that's not a bad thing. I
No.
mean, you know, there is something to that. I mean, I am rambling a bit here. I want to get around to respond to your views on Eliot, but I think I've mentioned on a couple of streams previously that the moment that poetry really became an interest or a kind of major thing in my life was when I was about 11, and a teacher gave us. We were kind of doing this whole thing on the Victorians, and obviously Victorian literature was a part of that. And he gave us each a copy of Tennyson's "The Charge of the Light Brigade"
Mm.
to read. And I remember just, even though, you know, I didn't know what the Crimean War was or who the Light Brigade were or anything like that, but from the first two lines, I was just hooked. I was like, you know, just the blending of the blending of the wordplay in order to make a, and the meter, of course, in order to conjure up this image of this cavalry charge to death. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
just I realized what the word poetry really meant with a capital P, if that makes sense.
And he uses such sort of ancient there are techniques that have such a long history, you know, when he like speeds up the meter and you get this sense of
Yeah,
the charge of the horses. I mean, that goes all the way back to you know, I think there's a passage in the Aeneid by Virgil where he does the exact same thing. And so
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it is just I think the appreciation of poetry deepens the more you realize that it's not strictly just about the meaning of the words, like you say. I mean, it is a, a, a musical thing at the same time, and in the same way that music abstractly suggests emotions or ideas,
yes,
even without words. As strange as it sounds, because poetry is of course composed of words, poetry can do the same thing. And you know, if you're a real master, I think you can write you know, nonsense verses which strictly have no meaning at all, but purely from the way that the words are put together and the way that the meter runs, there is meaning in that, and it will suggest impressions to the
well, of
reader or the
course.
listener, and it's such an amazing science, and it's with infinite depth to it. The more you learn,
It's really one of the. I mean, you know, my favorite philosopher Gomez Davila. He said that poetry is a fingerprint of God in human clay. You know, because of the kind of the ability of language to reach that kind of musical divine level. And I mean, to back up what you said, T.S. Eliot himself wrote that a poem should communicate before it is understood.
yeah.
That you should be able to get, even if you know nothing about what it's really talking about on a literal level, that you should be able to feel it in order for it to be a successful poem. That it should have that kind of uh, that kind of resonance with people. I mean, as you say, it goes all the way back to the Greeks. I mean, the reason that we call it lyric poetry is because a lot of it was to be performed with a lyre, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it would be sang. I mean, I don't speak any Greek. I was they attempted to teach it me at school, but it didn't go anywhere. Um,
Kaistu
so
Teknon.
No, I can't do it. I can't do it. But I
No,
have
that
listened
was a
to.
bad joke because I can't either. But I know that Kaisu Teknon means "and you, my friend," or "my brother,"
Oh,
or
of
"my
course,
son,"
because
rather.
it's what Caesar really said, because they didn't speak Latin in the Senate, isn't it? Because Latin was for plebs. I mean,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
but yes, and you can listen to people singing the Odyssey in ancient Greek, for example, and it does have this mystical quality to it. I remember I went with Pharaoh. No, I think you were there actually, or you were there on the day. I went with him to the British Library back in February to see an exhibition on Alexander the Great, and
Mm.
they had a video installation, and it was a Persian street poet, which is something we don't really have in the West anymore. But in the Middle East, a lot of these national epics and famous ancient poems are still well known and learned by a lot of the population, a lot of whom are illiterate. They have to be taught it
Oh, the
orally.
illiteracy is essential. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to. But if you go down the street, you'll see people busking and doing all these things. But you'll also see people performing poetry in the streets, and they don't simply stand there and read the poem. They act out
Mm.
um, what the poem is really about. And they act out all the things that are going on. And it is, I mean, bear in mind, of course, I don't speak any Farsi or whatever they speak in Persia. I had no clue as to what they were actually saying. But this epic about Alexander, who of course the Persians consider to be a Persian, because that's kind of how they are. Um, it just has this power to it. You see these people with these gestures that they've perfected over years, to perform this thing. But I don't want to get too off topic here, but Mr. Spasticus Autisticus in chat has put a quote in from Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky.
Oh yeah.
"'Twas brillig, and the slidey toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome rats out grabe." I mean, because one of another
Well, there's an
great.
ancient tradition of this stuff. I mean, and again, like
It's
going to Eliot. I mean, Eliot wrote what is it, Possum's Book of Practical
Well,
Cats.
I was about to bring that up, because that was my first experience of T.S. Eliot. Was when I was very young. I found in my aunt's house, I think, an old sort of edition, and a part of it was Possum's. What is it? Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. And I used to read a lot of nonsense books.
McCavity.
But
There's no one like McCavity.
but I mean, Possum's Book of Practical Cats isn't really nonsense poetry, because it does make sense on a literal level. But I used to read a lot of Edward Lear. I have like 10 different editions of the complete Edward Lear in my house that I've collected over the years, because it's just the sheer fun of it is what makes it great. Lewis Carroll obviously wrote that famous poem, which is entirely nonsensical. You get a sort of sense of what's going on. Thou hast slain the Jabberwock, my son. Halloo, hallay, etc. But it's just that basic aspect of wordplay is very important, not just in general, but particularly for understanding Eliot, who we're meant to be talking about. And I think, but really, this whole tangent is vital for that.
Well, in the
Because
same way that I think that again with nursery rhymes, these sorts of nonsense verses, these things were, I think, vital in Europe. I assume in other places as well, for sort of as a part of a child's poetical education, because as you say, it gives you the capacity to understand wordplay and understand what that means, and to recognize it and to decipher it, which when you're older will give you a much easier time actually comprehending a mature poem. It's sort of
yeah,
a strong part of your education, and like I said, I think these things are dying off now. Children aren't really I mean, also just their memories are just appalling. They can't remember anything at all.
no,
Terrible attention
no,
spans,
they
and I
haven't been
think
taught the recitation.
yeah, and so it's I think the capacity of the public to comprehend poetry is declining and declining and declining, and
Hmm.
it's very sad. It's very sad.
Well,
It needs to change.
it is particularly sad, and I mean, one of the great things about uh, be giving nursery rhymes to a very young child is that really it teaches them what meter is. It teaches them
Yeah.
what form is. They have an instinctive grasp of these things, you know.
Yeah.
That
I mean, everybody must do what Pharaoh does with his child. Read his child the Idylls of the King. It's like
gonna get
3-year-old.
Mallory.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
based. Yeah.
I mean, yes, and you know, this was once upon a time just what people did. You know,
Uh,
in every social strata, you recited and read nursery rhymes. And again, this is getting a little bit distracted from the topic here, but um, one of the hallmarks of traditional education in this country, and I'm sure in other countries as well in Europe, was learning by rote.
Yep.
Where you would, as part of your basic schoolwork, you would have to go away and learn a poem, and then you would have to recite it in front of people. And this was considered this was considered as basic as learning how to add up or spell. You know, this was just done all over the age spectrum in every type of school, every type of class. You would have to do this.
But now it's considered cruel or
Well,
archaic.
well, the argument against it was that it wasn't actually teaching people poetry; it was teaching them to recite it. But my defense of that,
such a fatuous argument.
well, but my defense of it is that a 6-year-old isn't really going to understand the content of, I don't know, Tennyson's Mariana, right, or something like that. They're not really gonna or you can't reasonably expect most of them to be able to grasp the matter of it. But there's a line in the Alan Bennett play, the History Boys, which always comes to mind, which is when they say, "Oh, sir, you know, why have we got to learn all these, you know, 1800s era romantic poems? This stuff hasn't happened to us yet." And the teacher, who's played by Richard Griffiths in the film version, says, because when it does happen to you, you'll have the words for it, and then you'll be ready to go, basically. And I think that's it. It's that once you've committed it to memory, the meaning will become clear. I think one of the most disgusting things about teaching English nowadays, and this is certainly the case when I was at school, not all that long ago, is that you're taught poetry as this kind of crossword puzzle where you have to, well, you know, you have to work out the meaning.
What color were the curtains in this stanza,
exactly.
etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah. In this line, he refers to the color purple, which implies that he is depressed. You know, so on. So it's
like your fundamental
not...
goal with reading children music, reading children poetry, is to get them to understand the musical. Fundamentally, poetry is a form of entertainment. Fundamentally, it is. All art forms are, I believe, at base,
it's what Samuel Johnson called they basically called the pleasures humanitori, you know, or something like that. It is pleasing to engage in poetry or music or drama.
It's delightful.
And
the problem is, again, I think so many of these teachers are so useless that they can't even read a poem properly. I mean, I was speaking with a friend in London who's been doing these sorts of poetical readings recently, and you know, I was praising him because I think one of the fundamental problems today is even if you give someone a great poem, they don't know how to read it. They don't know how to perform it. And I mean, in ancient Greece, for instance, or in ancient Rome, in antiquity, there's actually a very common thing that you would have a divide to some extent between the actual composer, the poet, the maker, and the performer. There would be professional performers called rhapsodes. And the rhapsodes, and rhapsode actually means, it comes from the Greek, to stitch together, because they would take certain passages and bring them together in a certain performance, you know, maybe apart from one book of the Iliad, apart from something else, depending on the situation. But the point is that you had professional performing, and performing was just as much of an art as making poetry.
Absolutely.
And yeah, well, I think we've lost that as well. It's unless it's something very, very simple. You know, I think people even struggle with, say, something like iambic pentameter today, which, you know, any child could read in the past. But you know, if you try and get someone to read,
the most simple meter, really.
Yeah, but if you try and get someone to read, you know, Christmas Eve by Browning, or something with real depth behind it, most people will just be utterly lost. And that's such a shame. It's such a shame. There's such a simplification that's come on. But I want to hear your opinion on this point about Eliot and musicality. I think we need to get into this.
Well, so I mean, if we look at Eliot biographically, I just wanted, because I mean, the whole thing about, well, do you bring in biography or not? Let's ignore that, because I think fundamentally with him in this case, it is central. He's born in the 1880s to a very, very upper class aristocratic American Boston Brahmin family.
Oh, the Brahmins. Yeah.
Though he doesn't grow up in Boston or on the East Coast, he grows up in is it St. Louis, Missouri?
St. Louis, on the big river.
Yeah, the old what is it they call it? Is it? Hang on, is it the river that's called the Big Easy, or is that the city of New Orleans?
That's New Orleans, I think.
That's New Orleans.
But that is on the Mississippi as well.
On the Mississippi, yeah. But so he grows up there.
Lincoln called the Mississippi the father of the waters, which I think is great.
That is, I mean, when you look at it, when you look at how it cuts through America there, I mean,
it's astonishing.
You can certainly. But anyway, he is quite a sickly child. He's often, laid up in bed. Becomes quite a precocious reader, I think, as a result of that.
He has an inguinal hernia, I think.
Oh, really? What is that?
A hernia is essentially, I think it's sort of, I couldn't tell you exactly, but I think it's a displacement.
The muscle falls out.
It's a sort of displacement of a muscle or an organ in your body. Very, very painful, and it meant that you couldn't really participate in sports and things. And it's funny. I remember there was a boy in school who had in my school when I was younger, had a similar condition, and I could never take part in any sports or anything like that. It was a really painful thing, actually.
So yes, he's laid up in bed a lot, reading. I think he he has this real proper classical education, partially through tutors and partially through his own efforts. Where he reads a great deal of these ancient texts and things, and then he goes on to Harvard in his late teens, and then I think he rises quite high at Harvard, and he very nearly. I think he originally intends on becoming an academic, and he does a PhD, which he completes, and then he goes to England. Do you remember why exactly that is? I have to look it up.
I think he went to Oxford for a year as part of his academic studies, did he not?
Right, it was a year at Oxford.
Yeah. And but he spent all of his time buggering off to London and palling around with Pound and the Bloomsbury types.
He begins to lose interest, I think, in studying academically.
Yeah.
He completes the written part of his PhD, but he decides to stay in England rather than go back to America to do the vocal exam. So he never actually
was it the Viva Voce or something?
Yeah,
they called it. Right?
That's right. And it should be noted that Eliot was something of a linguist. He's quite interested in, obviously, Latin and Greek and European languages like French and German, but he also takes a big interest in Sanskrit. And he has this kind of lifelong fascination with Indian religion and kind of Eastern
Buddhism as well.
Texts.
I think he considered Buddhism for a while.
Probably. Though he always had quite a distant relationship to the more kind of fashionable, slightly kooky aspects of the post-war world, to sort of fully convert and become a monk or something. And then he settles down, doesn't he? He marries Vivienne Haig Wood not long after staying in England. I think basically he admitted later it's because he was desperate to stay in Europe. And so he basically married in order to qualify.
Well, it was actually he even married her without telling his parents, which was quite a big deal. But I've got Pound's letters, and Pound actually basically says in so many words, like, try and marry this woman because you need to stay here. You can't go back. So I mean, Pound is always sort of an influence there in the background. The more you learn about Eliot and Pound, the more you see, because everyone knows, Pound edited The Wasteland, etc. But in so many ways, he was an influence on Eliot.
Oh, massively. I mean, he was the is it
Emilio Fabro,
the superior craftsman. I mean, they had a very close personal bond for many years. And Eliot, sorry, I mean Pound really was the the kind of editor in chief of everything Eliot wrote, I think, in the early years. Just by default. We should mention that Eliot's marriage to Vivian Haigh Wood was rather unhappy. Vivian
Rather unhappy. That's
rather
an understatement,
unhappy.
I would say.
I don't want to be uncharitable to them, but Vivienne was a mentally unstable socialite, and she very quickly developed a whole load of problems to do with fatigue and mental
Paranoia,
outbreaks and paranoia.
hysteria.
And in order to try and build a life for himself, Eliot first becomes a school teacher. And I mean, when I say make a life for himself, I really mean pay Vivienne's medical bills, which is what most of the money was going on. He
Yeah, for
becomes a
the
school teacher.
electroshock therapy or whatever the
Oh
hell
yeah,
it's
I mean,
called.
there's that's a whole topic in and of itself. The that whole episode, but he teaches English for a while, I think, and in fact, one of his early pupils was John Betjeman, who would go on to be a notable poet and poet laureate later in the century. He really doesn't like teaching or lecturing, and while he's lecturing at Birkbeck College, it's very likely, but not totally confirmed, that Bertrand Russell had an affair with Vivienne,
Yeah.
which led to this kind of lifelong distrust between Eliot and Russell. Um, and he quits teaching and gets a job in the Colonial Affairs Department of Lloyd's Bank in London, where he basically is a kind of balance sheet manager. And it should be noted because obviously this is the period of his life at which the wasteland comes out of it. There's this general assumption of kind of misery, because he was working a job in the basement of a bank, which everybody thinks, well, that must be terrible, especially for this kind of great artist and poet. And there's this, he's coming home every night to this nagging, ill, frenetic woman, but actually, from what I've been able to research into it, Eliot seems to have been fairly content at Lloyd's Bank. I mean, he worked there for 5 or 6 years, I think.
Yeah, he got a couple of pay rises. He was pretty
Yeah,
successful from what I know.
and he was known to be quite a competent man in his department. He very quickly rose to be fairly senior on that floor. Um, and I think, and he was asked whether or not he would want to quit, and he said no, because he said structure is key to writing poetry. Structure in the terms of your actual mundane life, and I think really he was onto something there, because I've noticed that periods of kind of listlessness, or kind of fallow periods in general in the lives of writers, do not actually lead to a greater output of work from them. I think, in fact, it is better to have something else on which to focus or to be employed on, in order to kind of work on, especially things like poetry. Though again, I suppose it does depend.
Well,
But
I mean,
there's
I think it's hard to make rules about these things, but I do think that fundamentally, if you spend all of your time, hunched over a desk trying to write poetry, then I mean, you need material, right? And the historical sense and study of past poets, study of history, study of literature, etc. These things are, of course, essential in a good poet or a great poet, but you also need a life.
Yeah,
You need a life
you
that you
can't
can
become
write about.
ossified in books and
Yeah.
writing, which is very easy to do. And in fact, Pound got together with all the kind of mid-20s Bloomsbury folk, and put together a subscription program by which they would raise up a stipend of £300 a year for Eliot,
Yeah.
Which was a fairly considerable sum back then. And when he found out about this, he was furious and turned it down, because he said, I didn't come to you asking for help or to be rescued from this job. He says, I'm quite content here. And he didn't want any, and I think he was very embarrassed in general by the fact they sort of tried to do that, to raise money for him as such.
I think Pound was absolutely opposed to labor. He hammers on a lot about that in his private writings. He said it's
Yes.
impossible for a poet to make a living from poetry, and to him, this was there was something disgraceful about that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he sort of modeled himself on the troubadours, of course, who lived off of the patronage of nobles.
Yes, indeed.
I suppose he wanted to do the same thing in his own life.
Yes. I mean, I suppose it's good if you can get it. Would be the
Yeah,
response to that. I mean,
yeah.
if you
I
want to
certainly
do
don't
that,
think I
fair enough.
turned it down.
I mean, it really. I think, as you say, it depends on uh what sort of it depends on what you're trying to write and what experiences you do or don't have. Um, I mean, you got someone like Robert Browning who just lived with his parents till he was about 36.
Yeah, he was a total
I
neat.
mean,
Yeah.
just I don't think he even wrote for most of that. He just sort of sat around.
He just sat absorbed because his dad had some like ginormous library in his
Something
house.
like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, Eliot publishes The Wasteland in 1922, which really, I mean, very often this idea that a single work of art is responsible for kind of a turning point isn't true. But I think really in this case, it does kind of. I think this and Ulysses, which are both published in the same year, Ulysses by James Joyce, that is, they really do kind of stick the spade in the ground, so to speak, at the
Yeah.
beginning of modernism. I mean, this is it now.
They
all
had,
of a sudden we're there.
and the Wasteland was as opposed to say Pound's early works like Personae, Allume Spento, his early collections, the Wasteland, and again, I do think part of this is because of Eliot's lyricism, right, and his music. You got to remember that 1922, this is the jazz age in full swing.
Yeah.
Literally. and so he writes this poem which has this, you have some of it in proof rock as well, but the Wasteland is really when he masters it, has this incredible jazz rhythm to it, this musicality, which I think was very, very accessible, far more accessible than Pound's troubadour translations and what have you. And yeah,
Yes.
it sort of really is has an electrifying effect. You have for instance, I've been reading a lot about Evelyn Waugh recently, and Evelyn Waugh is one of his best friends at Oxford, Harold Acton, and these are the sort of generation after. I think Waugh was born in 1903, thereabouts. They're at Oxford, and Waugh actually bases a character. He has a character, Anthony Blanche, in Brideshead Revisited. This really sort of camp character who stands on the balcony of his halls, declaiming the Wasteland through a megaphone. And this is actually Harold Acton actually did this, and he was the leader of the aesthetic movement at Oxford at the time. He headed the ISIS student magazine, one of the most sort of one of the big names on campus, and so yeah, it had a massive reception amongst the educated classes, amongst people who were fashionable, and of course it sort of filters out from there. Yeah, incomparable to any of the other works at the time. I don't think even Joyce had the same kind of impact as the Wasteland.
Joyce would have a somewhat more delayed impact.
Yeah,
I think he would really the influence of Joyce is felt a bit more heavily in the mid to late century. But just to give a bit more context to this, I mean, first of all, if you're not familiar with the Wasteland, you can hear Eliot himself reading it on YouTube. You can also there's a 2-part stream that John D and I did last
which
year
is very
in
good
April, I
actually.
think.
I was
Thank
good
you.
fun. I enjoyed that.
And it was great fun to kind of act out the whole poem. But anyway, the real shock I think of the Wasteland is that it kind of gets everyone 5 moves ahead, if that makes sense. I mean, one of the Wasteland sections just is called a game of chess, so that's quite apt actually. But he basically writes a poem that directly deals with the disillusion of the modern world, a disillusion which had not really been fully comprehended by most of the intellectual and artistic world. I think a lot of poetry, because you have that kind of semi-modernist Georgian period right before the First World War, where things are starting to take a bit of a turn. Then you have the war itself, which brings about the war poets,
Yeah.
and there's a kind of boom in that, and that is a mixture of the kind of traditional and the modern in a lot of ways. But and I still
Yeah.
really think, even over a century on, the war poets have not really been given their proper due or analysis in terms of what they did. I think for most people it kind of goes from Tennyson to Eliot, just
Mm.
straight away. They don't really cover the middle ground of it as such.
But even in people who are critical of Eliot and Pound, some of the war poets like Brooke, for instance, who
Yeah,
there's let's be honest. I don't think Brooke would have had as much success if he wasn't a good-looking man. I think he sort of
yeah, that's true.
glided by on his looks, but you do see in some of his poetry a sort of incipient dislocation coming through. Even he would critique the sort of the proper modernists like Pound and Eliot, but you see sort of he's playing around with punctuation and where the words are placed in the line and sort of playing around with traditional forms, and you do see this sort of stuff among the war poets. So yeah, it's not this sort of clean break that people like to imagine. I suppose
No.
there is a working up to Eliot and the Wasteland.
I think it's also fair to say that a lot of the really promising young poets were killed, of course. So their influence was never felt. I mean, you got someone like Edward Thomas, who wrote some of the most beautiful poetry of the last 100 years. Well, over 100 years now. I mean, I always open my Faber edition of his collected works. Of course, he was killed in 1917 at Arras. He's able to write a poem like Adelstrop, and then he's killed off before he can take that any further.
And of course, some of the big modernists were killed off as well. I mean, T. E. Hulme,
T. Hulme, yeah,
who massive influence on Pound. He was sort of I think Pound called him the first imagist poet. And he got blown to smithereens. They didn't even have anything to bury.
That's true. I think that the real shock, as I said, of Eliot is the fact that he forces everybody onto his level, basically, because you can't have the Wasteland coming onto the scene and then just go back to writing comfortable Georgian poetry. You just can't do it.
No.
By the way, just for context here, by Georgian I mean as in the reign of George V, kind of essentially the poetry between sort of 1901 and 1922. It doesn't correspond exactly to the reign of King George, but that poetry is kind of termed Georgian. And because again, once you've had the Wasteland and this kind of this confrontation directly with all the problems of modernity and sort of declining industrialism and mass culture and advertising and all this sort of thing, you can't ignore it anymore, because Eliot says, well, I'm not going to ignore it, I'm going to confront it directly. And I think the fact that he was American did somewhat play a part in that, because I mean, you read there's a book by the travel writer Bill Bryson called One Summer, which is about 1921, if I'm not mistaken. Was it not? But basically, it's about basically this one very important year in American history where all these sorts of things happened. And the way he talks about life, especially in the cities in a lot of America, is really, really strikingly modern in terms of how people live now. I mean, yes, it wasn't as degenerate or dissolute or confused as we are now, but the kind of mass culture, the way in which people live, the music people listen to, the hallmarks of it are all there. And if you contrast what it would have been like to live in America in say New York in 1922 with the kind of fashionable Bloomsbury set, or at least their early incarnation in that time, or just the British establishment in general, there was this kind of slightly paranoid parochialism where it's like, well, we can just go back to the way things were just before the war. We can just go back to 1910 and all the, but of course they couldn't. And the Wasteland is the poetic representation of that fear made flesh or made words. Well, no, because the artists, as Pound said, are the antennae of society, and they have a duty to actually deal with the world around them as they see it.
I think the poet, the poet especially, has always been, I would say, remarkable in this regard. I would say, um, I don't want to make judgments about which art is higher than the other, but one thing that you notice is a lot of visual art will sort of follow on where the poetry has already come, I would say. And I think poetry has always had this reputation. I mean, one of the old Roman words, because of course in ancient times the word poet wasn't an established term, really. I mean, the word just means to make, basically, in Greek. But one word which the Romans would use to describe a poet is they would call them awates, which is seer or prophet. Because there was this idea that a poet isn't just observing and recording in the way that a painter would say. A poet has a sort of sixth sense, if you will, is able to pick up on these extreme subtleties and trends and sort of shades of feeling, which most people can't pick up on, or if they can pick up on them, they can't articulate them. And I think that
they can't pick up on them yet. Yeah.
Yes. And so the poet sort of finds these things, or finds words to express these things, and can show them to people. And I think Eliot does talk about this again in his criticism and in his prose writings. This idea of this extremely, extraordinarily keen, sensitive observation of, and then you need to have the skill to be able to. I mean, I'm sure people who are listening to this will understand what I mean, or I hope they do, when I say that sometimes in one's life, one has a feeling or a sensation which doesn't really seem to have a name. You can't say this is sadness. You can't say this is anger. It's a peculiar sort of sensation. You might get it. If you smell a particular smell, or as a crude example, and it will bring a sort of complex of associations to you all at once, and it's this sort of, you can't even call it an emotion, because it's just, an emotion is a sort of the equivalent of a color to a painter. You could say that red is anger or whatever. It's more of a feeling. It's a composition, an image, and this is where this is the sort of the philosophy of imagism, which was the sort of early modernist movement. It is this idea that you have this unique complex of sensations, of feelings stirred by a particular situation, and I think a lot of people can perceive these things, but if you try and describe it in prose or in poetry, it is remarkably hard to get across exactly what you mean, to find the exactly right words for what you're doing. And I think this was the preoccupation of men like Eliot and Pound. Really, I think that's the preoccupation of a great poet.
And just on that point, I want to say that a lot of these artists, Eliot and Pound, quite famously so, were political reactionaries. They were not radicals. And I think one of the defining features of the Wasteland is the fact that it's all about everything kind of forming a formless whole. The boundaries and the classes and the sections of society are breaking down and becoming one with each other. And this is not presented as a good thing. It's presented as this extremely ominous, troublesome thing, because everything is going to be washed into itself. I mean, Eliot, he goes back and mentions Tiresias, this kind of androgynous Greek figure.
Well, the story about Tiresias, I think, is there was he essentially offended I think Hera. I think he offended Zeus's wife. Might be wrong. And so he was turned into a woman. And he was a woman for about 7 years. And then one day in Olympus, Zeus and Hera were arguing. The argument centered on who enjoyed sexual intercourse more. Did the man enjoy it more, or did the woman enjoy it more? And Zeus said, I know what we'll do. We'll get that Tiresias chap, because he's done both. He has forsuffered all enacted on this same divan or bed.
Yeah.
And so they bring him to Olympus, and he says that the woman enjoys it more. And Zeus wins the argument and rewards him by, I think, turning him back into a man. It's a really interesting story. And yeah, I think that I mean, Tiresias, Eliot said that he was the sort of central character of the Wasteland. Really, he's one of the linchpins in the poem, and it does go back to that sort of again. You were saying that really the problems that they were facing in the 1920s, they're not differences of kind, they're differences of degree with what we're dealing
Yeah,
with now.
exactly.
And there was a massive sort of gender confusion. I mean, people don't seem to realize this because they don't think about it a lot. But C.S. Lewis wrote about this actually in one of his nonfiction books, the flapper phenomenon, for instance.
Yeah.
Everybody knows, the sort of the short hair.
They wanted to be
Well, yeah, it was a sort of
boyish, basically.
boyish
Yeah.
look, basically, right? And
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis says, like, this is clearly symptomatic of a very confused, unhealthy society. It was sort of fashionable to have a flat chest, no hips, etc. So there was a sort of total chaos at the time that affected people very, very deeply. And I think to a very, very sensitive man like Eliot, he couldn't help but sort of take on some of this confusion in himself. And I think that's why he talks about himself, or uses the character of Tiresias as he does in the poem, as this sort of confused, this sort of this symbol of the confusion of the age.
I mean, I would just like to actually read that brief section,
Sure.
because he mixes Tiresias with this really quite grotesque sort of narrative about a young woman living in some awful flat in London somewhere.
Yeah.
With a kind of rich young man coming to
exploring hands
have
and
a bit of fun.
No defense and make a
Yes,
welcome of
exactly.
indifference.
I mean, if there was ever a passage from this that defined life in 2023 as well as 1922, then you know. But anyway, I'll just read you that section. At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing waiting, I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see, at the violet hour, the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea. The typist home at tea time clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out food in tins. Out of the window, perilously spread her drying combinations, touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene, and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. He, the young man, carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low on whom assurance sits, as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended. She is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which are still unreproved if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have foresuffered all, enacted on this same divan or bed. I who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. Bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again, alone, she smooths her hair with an automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone.
So good.
It's a lovely bit of domestic decline.
Yeah. But I mean, you change out a couple of details, and it could be a poem written today.
Really, it could. I mean, even the
really
line
could.
about a Bradford millionaire.
Yeah.
the only thing that's changed is the color of the Bradford millionaire.
Yeah.
There's still plenty of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as crooked.
It is amazing. I mean, there's something and I think this goes back to it would maybe be good to read out some segments of Eliot's critical essays, because one of his main concerns, and one of the concerns of someone like Pound as well, is this idea of if you want to write a poem, your goal should really be to write something that will become a part of the canon, right? And you see things like that. They're not just there for the reason that it has this sort of historical prestige. You will notice, for instance, if you read even something that a lot of the nationalistic types online like today, something like the Nibelungenlied or the Song of Roland, which are these epic songs from the 12th century, I think, 13th century. They bore after a while. Once you've read one of those things, you've read them all, and they don't have this wellspring of vitality. They feel immensely dated and distant. But if you read Dante, if you read the Inferno, it's an eternal work. It's as fresh and astounding today as it was when it was written. And that's because he's not dealing with discrete historical events just for the sake of it. That's not his goal. His goal, again, is he has, Dante, like Eliot, was an extraordinarily sensitive man. He felt and saw everything to a degree that most people just don't. And that poem is, on the surface, of course, it is a story about a nekuya, I think is how you pronounce the word, the idea of the heroic descent into the underworld, right? It's an ancient sort of trope or topos, but he's using it to express eternal ideas about the deity, about the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, the meaning of beauty, love. The goal is not to eulogize a dead king or a dead emperor, or even like some of the more what's the word, prosaic historians or academics today, who will say that the entire poem is just him trying to get across his gripes against people who he didn't like in Florence or whatever. I mean, again, that's an element of it. But all of these things are used in this, like I said, in the same way that a painter will use certain colors, certain objects, certain subjects, and arrange these things to produce an effect. And Eliot was absolutely laser focused on this, and he believed that if you write a poem which is worthy of the canon, it sort of it's outside of time in a way.
Because it has that eternal quality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the reason I always talk about the genius of Shakespeare a lot, and I always make the point that Shakespeare is studied in basically every classroom, every country in the world, and every language. Some a lot of the time it's performed in the original, of course, in the original English. All over the world, because the qualities of it are so universal. And as you say, a poem that enters the canon of a people, and really can't be forgotten, because I think that's really what marks it. It's not the fact that it wants to be great; it's that it can't not be. Really,
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of poems that desperately want to be great but can't be.
And I think thinking about things in this way, I think it can do so much, and it's very productive. And I think this is why, if you read someone like I don't know, even someone like Ginsberg, say, from the 60s, I think his work is so just obviously tinged with the sort of drug crazed, sex crazed, peace crazed movements of the time that if you read today, there's something, and I'll be honest, there is something enjoyable about it in a sort of deranged way.
I've always had a soft spot for Howl, even though I've got a lot of criticisms of it. But this is the thing, I haven't been able to forget it. It's not that I read it and went, wow, this is brilliant. It's I read it and went, oh, this is a bit strange, but it's never left me. You see, so that I think is really the quality of should I use the word good? I should say I would say rather interesting or notable poetry, because regardless of your actual conscious opinion on it, it doesn't leave your subconscious brain. It stays with you.
Yeah, it gets under your skin, definitely. Although I don't think that well, I don't know. I mean, I would say that Ginsberg's poetry probably wouldn't survive, but Pliny said the same thing about Marshall. And we have all of Marshall's books, so I suppose one can't ever really know. But I would like if you don't mind to read out the first section of probably one of T.S. Eliot's most important essays, which I think will help clarify a lot of people's, because there's so much sort of waffle today in right-wing circles or whatever you want to call it, about tradition. And I think this essay is, I mean, Eliot's critical essays are as fascinating as his poetry, in the sense that they are so fresh and so thought-provoking even today.
Before you go on, can I just do a bit of on-air planning? I think if we go through this, we discuss Eliot's critical views and his non-fiction a bit, and then if we can, we'll move on to Eliot's kind of I suppose post-Pound career. We'll talk about the four quartets and the war, and his career as a sort of Christian conservative pillar of the establishment, I suppose. Anyway, but yes, please do go on.
Okay, so this essay was actually published before The Wasteland. I think after, when was Prufrock published?
Prufrock was I think it was properly published in 1917.
Yeah, I thought 1917.
And just quickly, because I meant to say this earlier, sorry. Of course, it famously starts, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." And that line drew uproar, basically, because it's like, how could you bring the image of this horrible surgical image of somebody etherized on a table into poetry?
You see, it's so wonderful as well, because but it's so wonderful, those lines as well, because again, right, Eliot is, and this will go along with what I'm about to read, he's looking at tradition, but he's looking at the modern world. Oh, I've lost him. Great. Bugger. I'm going to see if I can get Benjamin back. Oh, for God's sake. Oh, this is what happens. This is what happens when you try and talk about poetry. You get attacked. The CIA. Oh, he's back. Here we go.
Are we still alive? Are we still alive?
Yes. Did the feds attack you?
No, StreamYards just threw me out. I don't know why.
Great.
But as long as we're still alive, sorry, go on.
But about those lines, I mean, again, he is confronting the modern world as this very horrible image, a patient etherized upon a table. But that line in and of itself is harking back to tradition. Because what's he talking about? He's talking about the sky, right? He's talking about the heavens. And in medieval literature, in ancient literature, the idea of the highest heavens, the skies, they called it the ether, right? So etherized upon a table. So you could see he's in this wonderful way bringing these things together. It's just, it is astounding how he could do this.
And of course, let's point out that the reason it works so well holistically with the rest of the poem is because, of course, Prufrock is about a central figure, a narrator, who is so comedically and tragically unable to commit to anything or do anything with any vitality or
was it like do I dare eat a peach?
Do I dare to eat a peach? And I grow old, I will wear the bottom of my trousers rolled. This kind of thing. I mean, the idea of the patient.
He wrote this when he was like 26 or something.
Yeah, this was his first famous poem when he was young, really. I mean,
but he was a bit of a late bloomer, relatively speaking.
Well, I've got a lovely facsimile copy of his early notebooks from just before he left America. And what's interesting is that a lot of the sort of half-finished poems in that are these quite traditionally considered poems on nature,
Absolutely.
on kind of feeling and things. And they're not bad, but the last poem in the notebook is the draft of Prufrock. And you kind of go, what? You know, he really went kind of, or it's at least based on the notebooks, he went from a fairly regular kind of journal of poetics just straight into Prufrock. You know, this kind of tired old man who is he lives his life like a patient etherized upon a table, so to speak.
I mean, this moment. I mean, people sort of, this is a sort of point that's talked about today. Oh, you know, Picasso painted traditionally before he did what he did, etc. But it really is. I mean, it's something that people still don't appreciate enough. I mean, when Pound was, I think, in his last year of university, for an entire year, he wrote a sonnet every day, and he destroyed most of them. You know, he anyone who says that he couldn't or he didn't write in a traditional way, he absolutely could. Some of them are very fine, but
I understand that we're meant to be getting onto something else here, but just quickly on that point, one of my biggest frustrations with the kind of right-wing sphere in general, and of course it's a problem with most people nowadays, but I noticed that it's particularly bad on the right, is there's no actual understanding of what the artistic process is like, even on a basic level. So, for example, I mean, all artists, whether they're writers or musicians or whatever, have to have a level of technical competence, and that requires practice. You know, Pound writing a sonnet every day. You know, Eliot with his notebook full of early drafts of things. I mean, you can, like I've said to people in the past, you know, you can write sonnets, say, full of nonsense words, if it's teaching you the technique, and if it's teaching you the use of meter, which of course, you know, everybody assumes that modernist poetry means, well, no meter, no form. That's not true.
No.
What it means is the interplay between forms more so than the lack of it. I mean, we've been reading from Prufrock and the Wasteland. These are poems that have all kinds of forms and metrical structures mixed into them. And I mean, you can look at the career of, we mentioned a visual artist like Picasso, who, you know, it's like, oh, you know, these are the paintings he did in 1890, whatever. Look how trad and these are. You know, they've got human realist, you know, figures and all this. But it's like, what they don't understand is that Picasso was growing up and training as an artist in that world, the world of the academies and the academic arts, and his move into modernism was one of the pioneering drives towards that. And you know, people act as if artists do this for a laugh, you know, but really the point is that if you're a painter or a writer or whatever, you have certain drives. You're almost kind of bound by the considerations of the circumstances and your own kind of ambitions to move into whatever form you feel will give best expression to your work. And I think people like, you know, the modern artists like Picasso, like Matisse, whatever, completely justified in moving into areas they did. And you can certainly have criticisms of individual work, but you can't take this lazy, parochial kind of, I suppose, almost like sort of Fox News, you know, like, or like Saga criticism of it, you know, Paul Joseph Watson type thing.
It's like Larkin said, you know, one writes the kind of poetry that one can write.
Exactly.
And you know, these you know, if you look at the kind of simple, well, not simple, but the kind of monastic poetry, say, of the Dark Ages, where, you know, every line ends with, you know, Ave Maria or something like this, or every stanza ends with that. These things are all right in their kind, but someone like Dante needed something else. He needed something else to express what he felt, what he knew. And so the forms have to change to keep pace with the sort of changes in feeling and consciousness.
Also, people don't realize the degree to which form is secondary to skill of expression, basically. Because, you know, I will read, say, Seamus Heaney or Geoffrey Hill in the morning, and then pick up George Herbert in the afternoon, you know, because ultimately what I'm reading is great poetry. The fact that they wrote in different manners of speaking, in different rhetoric, in different form, with completely different metaphysical considerations, This is secondary to the fact that their sheer skill at expression, which is the basic skill that leads to good poetry, was so great in each of those categories. They so clearly nailed what they were trying to express, or at least, in my opinion, they did.
And this is the thing, you can't that you can't be wrong, really. I mean, your feelings, say, might be based on an incorrect perception. You might be looking at the world in the wrong way, but that's not really the goal, I suppose. The goal is to be able to express what you're feeling, no matter what it is.
Well, I mean, look at someone like Pablo Neruda, who, on a personal level, on a political level, on a metaphysical level, I detest him. I detest his entire outlook on things. Often that comes through in his poetry, I find myself repulsed by it. But his skill at expression and the certain mystical, lyrical quality to his work means that, as I said earlier, I can't forget it. I will go back to it. I will read it again.
I feel the exact same way with Rimbaud. I really do. I mean, Rimbaud is if you ever want to be, if you people who aren't poets, who really don't try and write poetry, have no conception of how black-pilled reading Arthur Rimbaud makes you, because this boy quit poetry at like 21.
Yeah,
and went off to sell guns in Abyssinia.
But again, I mean, you can look at someone like Rimbaud, and the really fascinating thing in him is the viscerality of the image. It's the fact that he didn't shy away from talking about a boat adrift on a river full of vomit. It's like and again, I could sit here and I could write an essay, and it wouldn't be untrue, talking about the fact that I think the willingness to show off these visceral images in verse, on some level, has some sense of artistic immorality, and certainly a societal sense of immorality. But I will never degrade the act of writing those poems or suggest they shouldn't be read. You see, there's and again, I just want to do one last nail into this coffin. I want to attack this obsession with these kind of online idiots, who in some areas are very accomplished, but in this they seem to have no ground at all. Which is this constant, it needs to be trad. We need to return to, like, they'll post whatever, like this year's Turner Prize winner or whatever. That was only a few days ago, and then they'll say, okay, but he should have done a marble statue of a grim looking youth, and it's like, well, the problem is that it's all well and good to say, well, I don't like this piece of postmodern art or whatever, but it's no point spewing out all this criticism if you've got no grounding in what art is or what the process of making it is, because again, just demanding that everything is this kind of really shallow, unpainted marble statue type. I mean, I think somebody in the chat, my friend Narco Republican, he used the term, they can't see beyond their bourgeois standards, and that's it. It's and really, I mean, if you showed this sort of thing to artists from the period we're talking about here, from sort of 1912 to 1922, they would have said, well, this is just shallow middle class materialism.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just you want everything to be this kind of nice chocolate box, kind of, just this really, really kind of bland, inoffensive, unvital, conformist picture of what you want in the world. So
you see the problem, though. The problem is that in the same way that so many people are writing or producing art, quote unquote, today, and they don't have a proper grounding in creation. There's the exact same problem with criticism. Criticism is an art in and of itself.
It's a hallowed form, really.
Absolutely.
When you look at someone like Dr. Johnson.
And if you want to begin to critique art, you need to do the work. So I would recommend, firstly, you need to start with where art criticism really began. I mean, you could start, I suppose, with some of the ancients. You could read someone like Pliny. You could read Quintilian. You could read Cicero, and then you could going up to the Enlightenment. You could read someone like Winckelmann. Then in the 1800s, you could read Ruskin. You could read Matthew Arnold. And then you can read T.S. Eliot's sort of critical essays. And once you've sort of given yourself that grounding, then you can begin to critique art. But criticism isn't just oh, I feel this about that. I'm angry. I'm gonna express it. No,
Yeah.
criticism is a science. It's a discipline. Um, and it's why I'm quite hesitant unless something is egregiously bad, obviously bad. Um, I'm hesitant to criticize because I'm not a critic. I don't have that grounding. But anyway, should I get on with reading this
Yeah,
thing?
sorry, we got very sidetracked there. So just to bring
So
us
yeah,
back to where we were.
tradition in the
Um,
individual talent. This was published, I think, in 1919, so before The Wasteland, and it was part of a collection of critical essays which Eliot published called The Sacred Wood. There's essays on Dante, all sorts of things in here. I would heartily recommend it. Very interesting book. And probably the most famous enduring essay from it is Tradition in the Individual Talent. It's split into two sections. I'm just going to read, and if you want to interrupt or you have anything to say, just jump in.
no, I'll hold on to the end because
Okay.
I think it's best to hear these words uninterrupted.
Let me have a sip of my lukewarm coffee.
I'm going all out with just wine. I've got to do
Okay.
about half a bottle in this stream anyway.
Okay. Tradition in the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so and so is traditional, or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. And again, there's so much of this today, right? This archaism. We need to go back and write like Milton or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Stale attachment to form is what I would call it.
Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race, has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French. We only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were the less spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. Yet, if the only form of tradition, of handing down, consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer and within it the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. In a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them, not judged to be as good as, or worse, or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. It would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in is a test of its value. A test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied, for we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. We say, it appears to conform, and is perhaps individual, or it appears individual, and may conform, but we are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. The first course is inadmissible, the second is an important experience of youth, and the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. That this development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly, is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement, perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine, perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Precisely. And they are that which we know. I am alive to a usual objection to what is clearly part of my program for the métier of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, pedantry, a claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. It will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. While, however, we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness. It is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape for examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. Some could absorb knowledge, the more tardy must sweat for it. Shakespeare required more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. And then he goes on to the next segment. But I think that everybody needs to read that and read it a couple of times and really drill down into what he is saying there. Because what he's essentially saying is these things are all of a oneness. The great poetry of someone like Dante or Shakespeare or Homer, these things live outside of time in a way that the poetry that we want to write should. And I think actually this wasn't just a eccentricity of Eliot's, this point of view. I think he was influenced by Pound. I shared with you the other day. I don't know if Benjamin's here. He might be having a wine or something. But I shared an essay with
No, I'm here. I was lighting a pipe. Sorry.
Oh, good man.
Noisy.
But Pound in I think 1913. Anyway, he published a book called The Spirit of Romance, which is about sort of the troubadour tradition, the medieval tradition of vernacular poetry, in Occitan, and French, and Italian, etc., as opposed to Latin. And in that book, there is, I think it's chapter 5, there is this remarkable chapter called Psychology and the Troubadours. And it displays Pound's hope that through a scientific observation of art and of poetry, we could approach to a sort of similar mental condition, or a sort of step outside of time, step outside of the flow of things, and just be in this space of pure art and pure experience and pure delight. It's one of the most, it's Pound at his most esoteric, I would say, and it is quite hard to grasp what he's talking about. But the essential point is that you can't. The desire should not be to just jump back to some form that you think is traditional, or is good art, or is proper art. The art needs to live, and if it's not living, then it's not art. If you've not tapped on something new, then essentially you're a copyist at best, even if your words are different. If you're just getting at the same sentiments over and over again, things that are tired and have no real relation to life today, you're not creating art. You're not really an artist.
No, it's as you say, it's the chasing of transcendental values, and the
sublime. The sublime.
Yes, essentially, the attempt to grasp the sublime, which always comes first. And I mean, it goes without saying, this is something that Eliot understood so keenly. I mean, as you just heard in that essay, and I think the attachment to forms in any age, but especially in ours, is a particularly damaging thing. Yeah. Just because you're not actually engaging with the art. It's like there are lots and lots of people who have told me, "Oh, it's a shame about all this modern poetry sort of thing," or these kind of obstinate. They tend to be Gen Xers, funnily enough, who always kind of have a go at people like Eliot or Pound. They go, "Oh, listen to all this modernist." And
again, they just don't have a proper education.
Well, but the problem is the people that say these things don't understand poetry at all. That's the problem. If I've heard criticisms of Eliot's work, of Pound's work, of Keats, of Swinburne, like whoever you want to name, there are intelligent critics and lovers or writers of poetry who can critique art in a way that is both kind of in good faith and kind of honorable, to use that, if that makes sense. Like, this is especially common when poets get together and talk, because like all professions, poets have kind of insider only conversations. I've heard people discuss, I've heard people talk about weaknesses, say, in the four quartets or in Keats's odes, for example, or any of these things. And but you're hearing criticism from somebody who respects the work, respects the artistry, and understands what goes into making not just poetry, but art in general, as you say, this attempt to grasp a hold of the sublime and to try and embody it in some way. And so some poster talking about how, modern art bad, trad art good. The problem is they don't understand any of the words that they're using. They don't actually understand the processes or the aspects that make these things really what they are.
I mean, you've got to understand. I mean, if people only understood that, when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, or when Arnaud Daniel, who he was the one who Dante actually described Arnaud Daniel as il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman, the greatest craftsman, the greatest troubadour who ever lived. When these men were writing, when they were composing their works, it was absolutely cutting edge. Nobody had done what they had done before. And if you read the troubadour tradition, there's a great website online actually called trovar.org, I think. And you can get a lot of the most famous troubadours from the 13th century, men like Arnaud Daniel, Arnaud de Merveille, Bertrand de Born, who Pound loved. And you get the English translations. And what you can see in some of their forms, some of the poetic forms which they used, there was one, I believe it was called a descor. And it's essentially a kind of, there are no hard and fast rules of composition. I would hesitate to call it free verse. You can't go that far. But, it is far, far freer than people are apt to think when we're writing back then. And you got to understand that, someone like Pound went on a massive, deep study of the troubadours. He learned the language. He translated the poems. He went walking for hundreds of miles in the south of France. He went to Toulouse. He went to Poitiers.
And remember, these people were reactionary. And that it's so fundamentally true, because Pound, for example, I mean, his entire poetic career was an attempt to return to the more primal forms of verse as expressed in the early to Middle Ages, as you've said, or even in kind of medieval Chinese poets or ancient Chinese poets, or just Western classicism in general, but classicism as an authentic expression rather than simply an academic classification. And you see this in painting as well. A lot of the modernists were actually more in touch with traditional forms of painting than were the conventional painters of, say, the 1890s, because the obsession with realist representation of concepts or of people or of figures in general was it's a fairly isolated period in the history of art. I mean, you go back and look at the depictions of saints or of knights in medieval churches, or anyone in medieval churches. They're not these are consciously not realist representations. They and nor are they idealist representations. You're actually looking at a certain type of figuration when it comes to portraying figures, when it comes to portraying religious myth or national myth or any of these things. That is not dependent on this bizarre insistence on late Victorian academic realism. And again, I want to stress something. I'm not a great defender of postmodern art or conceptual art, and I am a lover of academic painting. I own many prints of these sorts of works alongside modernist and medieval and Renaissance works, because as we've stressed over this stream, art is more than the form. Art is more than the particular conventions of a particular time period. You know, I'm not going to trash Victorian art for being realist any more than I'm going to trash medieval art for not being realist, because the point is the very nature of the expression.
No, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that you see come through, which people will say it's unpoetic or it's not traditional again. There's a lot of talk of science, and this is really interesting. You see this in Pound, you see it in Eliot, especially in Pound. But again, it comes through. Like Eliot makes a scientific analogy at the end of that essay. And he talks about essentially comparing different poetic forms, because you have to have a complete understanding of the tradition, right? And the way that you do that is through a deep, objective comparison of different poems. Take a poem from the Romantic era, take a poem from the 13th century, compare them, see what's different, understand how things have changed, why they have changed, understand the evolution of the art. And then you can also, in terms of science, this is a bit of an aside, there's this idea, I suppose, that poetry should be all about feeling and experience. Poetry is a subjective thing fundamentally, and I think that's a flawed understanding, and it's not something that the modernists would have agreed with. I think that's something that can only come in a postmodern era. I think the point of a poet was that he expressed the truth. There was an absolute firmness in your conviction, in a belief in the sublime, in a truth.
If there was ever a golden rule among poets, again, I'm talking about it as a profession here. The number one rule would have to be never, ever, under any circumstances, put any verse to paper that you do not fundamentally believe is a true expression of what you're feeling or thinking about that particular thing. Never write a poem in bad faith. That, I think, would have to be the cardinal sin, because if you do that, it spits in the face of everything the art is about. Essentially, it spits in the face of the very, very primordial instincts that put art into existence. Never chase a principle via art you don't actually believe in, because it is. I mean, in my mind, it would be a mortal sin. If I was going to be like Dante and cast everyone into hell, that would be on the very bottom rung. Along with along with the very worst sin. I was going to make a joke, but I won't, because I don't want to distract from the seriousness of the point here.
And I think another a friend gave it to me when I was down in London, actually, to visit you. There's this wonderful book called European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages. It was written by a German guy called Ernst Curtius. And this book is amazing, because what it will show you is it will show you that going all the way from Homer, all the way up to Goethe. And then, he has a lot of praise for this book. Was written in, I think, the 1940s. He has a lot of praise for the modernists, because what he sees in the modernist work is a rejection or a reaction against a trend that had existed in poetry really from the late 1700s onwards, of moving away from the tradition, having a sort of just a focus on form, like you say, but no understanding of the actual the legacy that has been left to us by European literature.
Could I briefly interrupt you to crystallize what you're saying in an illustration by Dr. Johnson, who was very, very annoyed at this development. I don't think he was aware of it more broadly, but he certainly saw a great deal of poetry that was kind of classic in a shallow way. It was only classical by form, and the chief mode of expression for such writers was the Alexandrian hexameter, right?
Yeah.
And his example of how you could use all the classical heroic forms you wanted and write the most banal verse was he wrote a couplet which was to illustrate it, which was I put my hat upon my head and walked into the Strand, and there I met another man whose hat was in his hand. It's just it's such a perfect crystallization of the mundane in a
Because of course,
heroic ancient
metrically
verse.
it's perfect, but you're not
Yeah, it's
expressing
absolutely
anything.
perfect. But you know,
Yeah, I mean
yeah,
that's absolutely it. But I mean, this book, he goes through, and I would heartily recommend if you can get a hold of it, get a hold of it. European literature in the Latin Middle Ages, and he talks about all of the again, poetry wasn't just this feeling; it was a science, it was an art, it was a discipline. There were all of and it was, and form was a part of it. Obviously, you wanted to master the forms, but there were also, for example, you would study the auctores, right? The authors. You would study, going from Homer onwards. You would have to read Virgil, Statius, Horace, Ovid, etc. Ovid, especially, was considered essential to read
yeah,
because in the
which is
Middle
still
Ages,
true.
absolutely, yeah. Um,
Anybody listening to this, if you're not familiar with the works of Ovid,
you have to read
please
the Metamorphoses.
take yourself away and go and read it. Just do it.
If you've not
No
read the
excuses.
Metamorphoses, you miss so
I don't
much.
want you watching my channel if you haven't read Ovid. Turn off and go and read it.
And then he talks about the topoi as well, right?
Yeah,
The topics, and this was something, again, people will say, um, this is sort of stale, but again, these things aren't stale, because these, you've got to think about, say, what would be an example of a topoi? Thinking about um, what do they call it? A genius loci, or a
yeah,
loci amenus, right? A pleasurable place, a grove, or something like this. These are things that you absolutely have to understand. You had to understand, for example, the symbolism of different flowers, of different trees. All of these things are essentially ingredients. And I talked earlier on about this idea of, you want to express these subtleties of feeling, these sublime moments that you can't express through regular speech. That's why you use poetry. You've got to think about all these different things, say metaphors about your heart, for example. People would say weird things in the Middle Ages, like "my heart is on my knees." These
yeah,
strange expressions which we really don't understand today. And you got to understand that all these things are ingredients, and if you put these ingredients together, if you arrange them in a certain way, they will produce an effect, a subtle effect, which you can't get in any other way. And so when the knowledge of these sorts of things was lost in the age of classicism, or classicistic studies, going on from the 1700s, late 1600s, maybe increasing up, these things were viewed as sort of barbarities, and it couldn't
mm,
be further from the truth. In fact, if you lose these ingredients, then you lose the ability to express something new. And T.S. Eliot described this book by Curtius as a magnificent book. Those were his words. So I would encourage anyone to get a hold of that, and you will see
I'll go
the
get a
actual.
copy. I haven't read it.
Oh, you've got to get it. You see the bones of the tradition there. You see actually what that means. It's not just
Mm,
form. It's understanding the authors. It's understanding the turns of phrase that were used, figures of speech, all of these things, and they're still valuable. Eliot uses them. All
hmm
right, Eliot uses them all the time. Pound uses them. Another book which I think would be very, very valuable for people to read, one of Dante's contemporaries, a man named Guido Cavalcanti. Pound translated Cavalcanti's songs and his poems, and he talks exactly about this. He says, Pound was obsessed with that period, the idea of courtly love and la donna ideale, the ideal woman. Today, again, where people are going on from the 1700s, there was this idea, these poems are just simplistic love poems. It's that's all it is. But if you read, say, Dante's prose criticism, or you read the stories that Boccaccio tells about Cavalcanti and Dante, you see that Dante had read everyone. He had read Homer, he had read Virgil, he had read all the classics. He was incredibly knowledgeable about science as well, and you
Yeah,
see that come through in the Inferno, in the descriptions of the heavenly bodies. He was as cutting edge and up to date as he could be. And
literae humaniores, very much so.
exactly. And you can't, if you read Cavalcanti's sonnets, or his love songs, you can see that on the surface of things, it might just seem like a regular love poem to you, but in fact, they are absolutely rich with symbolism that people don't understand because they have lost touch with the topoi, with the authors, the classical tradition that had been handed down, since Rome. Really, the Latin
Mm,
tradition begins with people like Virgil. Um, and you need to understand it if you want to understand the full richness of literature, and if you want to write things which are vital, which are living.
absolutely. I mean, I'm very very glad that we basically conquered this particular territory on this stream, because I think really it's more valuable than a simple kind of blow by blow account or analysis of what Eliot wrote. Are you all right to go for another half an hour or more?
I think I could do about 20 minutes, but then I'm gonna have to dash.
All right. I just want to quickly
But we
we
could
should
do
do
we
some
could
of
do a
Eliot's
part
later
two
career.
possibly at some point.
Yeah, that's a good point. We could do a part two. Would it be worth then holding off on doing his later career, or do you want to talk about Eliot's kind of Christian period and the four quartets, or we could talk about him as an editor, or
Well,
um,
I think it's gonna be hard to sort of go into it. But one thing I think that would be valuable, because again, it sort of goes along with this idea of I think if you look at the four quartets, which is Eliot's sort of last major work, I think there is this, again, the same obsession that you see in Pound and Eliot's earlier work. Of course, there are differences, and as you say, he's much more um, religious. He's much more focused on his faith, say. But
yeah,
there is, again, this obsession of great art being sort of timeless, and really all of the great figures, all of the great truths of history are outside of time. They are always true. And so I think one thing that I would like to do is read just a bit of Burnt Norton, because I think that
absolutely. Please do.
he expresses that so elegantly there. This, for anyone who doesn't know, the four quartets is split into four parts,
Yeah,
and it begins with Burnt Norton. And Burnt Norton
they
was
were
this
they
a
were they're
house,
just
I think.
so people know they were not originally published as a set of poems. They were separate. They were
Yeah,
separate poems Eliot wrote and published from 1936 up to 1943, I think.
I think so.
And they were later collected as the four quartets. And they're kind of I always describe them as rather scholastic in their
Mm,
outlook. There is a kind of almost Thomist uh, quality to them. They're very kind of Anglo-Catholic. They talk about kind of I know Mother Julian of Norwich is figured a fair bit in the poems, as is kind of the pre-Socratic and the Aristotelian and the Eastern.
mm.
But they are undoubtedly some of the finest verse written in the last 100 years.
So I guess
And yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no. I guess I'll read Burnt Norton, and then you can talk about it, and then we'll leave off until our next
Yeah, let's do that.
discussion. All right. Okay. Burnt Norton, T.S. Eliot. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. But to what purpose, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, round the corner, through the first gate, into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush? Into our first world. There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat through the vibrant air. And the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye beam crossed, for the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. There they were as our guests, accepted and accepting. So we moved, and they, in a formal pattern, along the empty alley into the box circle to look down into the drained pool. Dry the pool, dry concrete, brown edged, and the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose quietly, quietly. The surface glittered out of heart of light, and they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. Go, said the bird, for the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly, containing laughter. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. And I mean, I just want to stop there for a second because it's stunning. And again, you might not get the sense of that hearing it for the first time or reading it for the first time, but there is something in that. I think, who is he talking about? Who are these people who are behind him, reflected in the pool? And I think it reflects to some extent his obsession with tradition. And again, you see this there's this same obsession with figures in the past, which you see in Dante, for instance, when he goes when he's in the Inferno and he sees the great authors of the past. He sees Statius and Horace and Homer, and he's sort of admitted into their company. There is again something of that here. These figures from the past are eternally present. They're always with us. These things are always here. Time past and time present or in time future. So I think again, those ideas of tradition are there even in his final poems. In a sense, they're stronger.
Yes, and I mean the one of the kind of most astounding things about the four quartets. I mean, to a level that, frankly, I don't think I've lived long enough yet. I've not been aware of them long enough yet to really get a grasp of them in this level. Because, as you say, this is his, or at least this partially is his attempt to deal with the problem, as we said, of canon, of tradition, of the history of that which comes before you. I mean, I'm trying to think which critic it was. It may have been Harold Bloom, a great critic. He's my favorite cantankerous old Jew that ever lived. But he,
but there's so many. How could you possibly?
But he used to write about the anxiety of influence, if I'm not wrong, where basically as each young artist comes into his own or attempts to come into his own, he's always weighing up against this anxiety of what came before. And as you say, this idea of kind of reflections in a pool, and this kind of this haunting effect, if you think, because of course reflections in a pool, as an image, they're wavy and they're inconsistent and they kind of are distorted, if you like. And as that very haunting line says, humankind cannot bear very much reality. And then, of course, we return to the meditation on time.
It's as if those truths that are there are so much. I think you can only sort of, and again, you see this with, say at the end of the Inferno or at the end of the Paradiso, say, whenever in medieval poetry the Godhead is seen, you come to the ether. These things are sort of beyond description. That kind of truth can't be born for very, very long. And I think that's what you're getting at there with saying man cannot bear very much reality. The reality is that all these things are imminent. The sublime is there. And in this world, we can only catch it in glimpses. At least that's how I take that passage. But I mean, it's you. Again, I don't think that you can appreciate someone like Eliot properly unless you have done the kind of reading that used to be considered normal, used to be considered mandatory. And so you're missing out on so much there. So I would encourage.
I want to agree with that point, and also make a preliminary pushback against this argument that this kind of poetry is by intellectuals for intellectuals. And I would refer to something that the late Sir Geoffrey Hill said, which is that people attack some poetry for being difficult, as if that's a real problem, that it all has to be simplified. And his response to that was always to say, well, difficulty is really kind of democratic, if that makes sense, in terms of your readership, because it means that you don't pretend to or pretense to insult the intelligence of the reader. That you assume that the reader either has the background required, or if not, you give them cause to want to have that background. I mean, speaking personally, I was fortunate to have quite a good education, but I mean, it was nothing like the sort of education that, say, Eliot would have had in the 1880s. So, I mean, a lot of it to me has been a slow process, but that, I think, in itself is an enjoyable virtue of the work, because not every pleasure has to come to you served quickly. Sometimes it's nice to have these works of art that go through life with you, and your appreciation and understanding of them changes as you go on. I mean, I'm certainly not afraid to say that, when I was younger and I tried to get to grips with modernism with Eliot when I was in my teens, it was a failed attempt. I mean, the Wasteland interested me more than the four quartets did, and the four quartets I kind of arrogantly rejected as kind of these are just philosophical essays with line breaks. I just didn't get it really.
No, you should see my early annotations on like my first copy of Pound. It's like a sort of a chimpanzee trying to comprehend.
It's reeing.
Yeah, just reeing. I don't understand
what is this. I mean, but I think that initial difficulty is perfectly fine, as long as you don't become a kind of reactionist, where you kind of have this like normie conservative thing of like, well, it isn't a comfy nationalist chocolate box painting, so I'm going to reject it. As long as you have that willingness to reconsider, it's fine. I mean, I'm somebody who, when it comes to art and understanding, is always humble, because I've read enough poetry and seen enough art that I now love, that when I first saw it, I couldn't. I was like, what is this? I don't have time for this. Like it always reminds me of the story of the French writer André. Is it? I'm trying to pronounce his name. I think it's André Gide. When
I'm not sure. I think it's Gide, is it not? But I
Gide or Gide. Anyway, but people know what I'm talking about. But when he was working for the French New Review publishing house, and he was sent the first volume of Proust's Recherche à la Temps Perdue, and he read it, and he sent it back with a rejection letter, pointing out a few minor grammatical errors, and also saying, I don't see why you need 30 pages to tell us how a fellow goes to bed in the evening, And of course, this haunted him for the rest of his life, that he had been the publisher who had initially rejected Proust, who had gone on to become one of the great novelists. And he never lived it down, and he was always writing, he used to say, well, I was very stupid, but he would say, well, look, one of the hallmarks of great art is that when you're first confronted with it, you don't always get it. You don't always see. I mean, I remember the first time I looked at the Wasteland, I don't think I even got through the first part. It's not that I hated it. I just thought, well, I got no idea what this is. I can't, I just wasn't ready for it yet, I suppose.
I think, it's not to disparage. I do think there is, and again, I think this is another place where the study of troubadours can be instructive, as being essentially the ancestors of all vernacular poetry in Europe. There is obviously a place for songs, right? Things that are immediately understandable. You hear it sung, and that's it. You understand. A song about love or a battle or whatever. These things are good in their own place, of course. But in troubadour poetry, there was a distinction, right? And I'll probably butcher the pronunciations, but essentially they recognized two different kinds of poetry. You had trobar riche and trobar clus, right? And this is essentially trobar clus is closed, or closed poetry, closed music, closed song, and trobar riche is the opposite. Trobar riche would be, again, songs about battles or love affairs that are the kind of thing that you could sing to a public and they would appreciate and understand. I suppose they're equivalent, I don't know, the Charge of the Light Brigade or something like that. But then they also had Trobar Clus, which was considered the higher art, really.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of poetry of someone like Arnaud Daniel, carried on by men
Or
like
T.S. Eliot.
or T.S. Eliot, where you won't get it on the first reading or the first hearing, but in the fact that it's not willfully inaccessible. The author isn't setting out to confuse you. If he is, then that is bad. He's writing in bad faith, right? But what he's dealing with is, again, emotions, sensations, realizations of such complexity, such depth, that it can only be, again, man can't bear much reality. These things can only be expressed in a sort of elliptical way. There literally aren't words to describe these things fully. And so the style becomes closed and complex and difficult to understand and to read. But if you give it a chance and you let it work on you, you let the words play on your imagination and throw up images, and feelings, that in of itself is going to be very, very valuable to you, and it's something that you can come back to again and again and again. It's the difference between a very wide, shallow pool, which you can splash around in and have a good time, and I don't know, a sort of hidden lake somewhere where you can dive deeply and you can find beautiful treasure underneath the water.
Absolutely.
And again, there's a place for both of these things, but to say that poetry should be entirely one thing or entirely other is missing the point. There's there's art for different occasions, and I think in a way, some people get themselves into a problem believing that all art should be this high, inaccessible, closed art. And some people think that it should be the opposite. They'll say, like, "Oh, it's just a bunch of posh nonsense,
Well,
whatever."
I
I don't want
mean,
to listen to it.
we
Both of those
mentioned
approaches are wrong.
we mentioned earlier how it's so wrong to insist that art depends upon a particular form, and it's also wrong to think that art depends on unintelligibility or snobbery. I mean, and there are plenty of people out there who, I have these really, really lovely, intelligent, cogent discussions on modern art with them, and all of a sudden they betray the fact that they only like it because it's unintelligible. They only like it because you've got to know the vocabulary. You've got to know the terms of discussion. And again, it doesn't matter how you cloak that up. It's a betrayal of the fact that it's not what this, because sometimes the sublime is implicit and sometimes it's explicit. I mean, think how many people read a work like, say, Lord of the Rings, right, or something like that, which I think in some ways can be both. It can be, I can't remember the terms of the troubadours there, but it's the high art and the low art simultaneously. It can appeal to a great mass of people, but it's not simplistic either, right? And it has a kind of it has an understanding of the myth and the poetry, which Tolkien, of course, famously called mythopoeia, things like this. So I think we're doing a credit to Eliot's work here by repeating this insistence that it fundamentally it is about the capacity for expression and the attempt to reach the sublime, and the fact that all these things like form and appeal and audience, they are important and they do matter very, very much. But ultimately, the reason that any of this exists in the first place is simply the move towards the sublime and the desire to express certain attitudes, or what used to be called virtues.
Yeah, I mean, they're only valuable in so much as you approach that. And I do think there's a problem. I mean, one of the problems today, I suppose, it's this idea of obscurity for the sake of obscurity, or even the fact that you're simply obscuring the fact that you don't really have anything to say.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of that. And again, if you don't have a basis in the classics, in the tradition, then you can be fooled by these things quite easily. You could have a poem which might, on its surface, read tolerably well. It might, it might have a decent rhythm or metric, but you'll realize if you really make a study of it and you know what to look for, that it's making claims of complexity and sublimity that really aren't backed up by what's there. And so, yeah, I think the study of these things will enhance your critical faculty, but you need to think of it as a faculty just as important as anything else.
Absolutely.
Be wary of dismissing something or accepting something unless you've done the work.
And I think the fact is, if we're going to be dissidents and we're going to attempt to exist in a kind of headspace which is detached from all the problems of modernity, the least we have to do is, if we're going to open our mouths and spew forth on any particular subject, we've got to be knowledgeable. I mean, I don't know the first thing about molecular biology, so it would be completely pointless for me to sit here and give opinions on it because I don't know anything about it. But I have spent a lot of time learning about and reading poetry. So I feel like it's, and I don't like
it's
this.
amazing. It's amazing how many Renaissance men there are posting on Twitter. You think if they had this,
they know everything. Yeah,
yeah.
But I think one of the great sort of grotesque factors of the internet is that it spurs on this endless capacity to comment and to have takes upon things, and it drives one to nausea, really, when you have to sit there and look at it. I mean, just people spewing forth on things they've got no frame of reference for. They've got
and
no
I'll be honest. I mean, I've done this. I mean, I think
so have I. So have I. I mean, I'm not excusing myself. Yeah.
I think if I had come across this book this book by Curtius, for instance, a couple years ago, I would have done that thing of reading maybe the first couple chapters, and I'm like, oh my god, this is based. Yeah, and start tweeting about it. But I have not mentioned. I think to my credit, I've not mentioned that book on Twitter. No. I'm like, if I'm going to talk about this book,
these are good habits.
Finish it first. I'm going to understand what I'm talking about. There's so much of sort of, and again, we talked about this when we were in London. It's a business, right?
Yeah.
For a lot of people, it's a business model. It's like I need my hot takes.
Just before, I want to read something actually. Again, this is very, but again, I just want to say to people, any stream on this channel, the whole point is it's very impromptu. So we do cover.
We
kind
may
of
have rambled a little,
but that's what I like. So that's what we're doing. Just before we went live, I think, or just after, the Prudentialist posted a small piece of verse. I think he wrote himself, and it says the following: "The poster stare with glassy eyes defies the empty page. His knuckles white, his face is lined and streaked with tears of rage. 30 tweets ago, how the words would flow with witty disposition. But now his mind is dark and dulled by clickbait and indecision." And now I have to say, I mean, again, not to disrespect, because he is a very, very good friend. I would have counted before this the Prudentialist as one of those very posters. The people who have this, who kind of live a life performatively, shall we say, which I think is one of the great problems with the internet, as we've said. I mean, you just said about this whole thing about resisting the urge to read like 2 pages and then going and tweeting about it. It's the problem is that we I think all literature and art, to an extent, particularly literature, is what Gomez Davila called a dialogue between two men across centuries, right?
Absolutely.
And part of understanding is the solitude of it, the fact that you have to go away and make it purely about yourself and the person whose dialogues you're reading, right?
Yeah. Because a painting or a building fundamentally is an object which is distant from you. But yeah, a poem, it is the person. The person is there.
Yeah,
I agree.
It's and I mean, what I hate these characters online. Again, many of whom are friends, and I don't want to just sit here and slam them. But people who are they everything has to become a post. Every thought they have has to become like a kind of quirky tweet, to try and get as much attention as possible. And what annoys me is the fact that they're so they don't seem to be able to be honest about it. If they were just honest and were like, yeah, that's what I like doing, I'd be okay with it almost. But it's the fact that they're always cagey about it when you ask them, like a kind of addict.
Mhm.
And
Well,
funnily
it's like
enough,
Eliot says in that letter, these things and awareness of tradition, what people used to call culture, being a cultured person.
yeah,
You only get these things by really hard effort. And again, it's like I say, I think there are different different things that are appropriate for different times. And if you're a political commentator and you need to keep up with the news, if you're a journalist, fair enough. There have always been people
I
like that, and it serves its purpose. It does its
my
thing, but you can't claim to be a literary critic at the same time because it's an
my
entirely
my
different thing.
my fundamental question to everyone in this sphere who engages in commentary or engages with certain things is the following: are you doing it because you derive a pleasure from it and because you wish to improve your own learning, or are you doing it because you want everybody else to think that you're quote based?
Mm,
If the latter
that's
is
it.
true, desist.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what I would say. In fact, I've been drafting for some time now, um, because a lot of my writing that I do mainly just for myself. Um, I again, I hate making this distinction, but I like to write both quote serious again. I don't like making that, but I
Mm.
like to write quote serious poetry and also just kind of like light verse for entertainment. I suppose like how Eliot has the Wasteland and also Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, type thing.
Yeah, I
Which,
mean,
in
they
case anyone
basically
doesn't know,
Pound would write these sort of iambic light verses for dinner
yeah.
parties and things like that for fun. I mean,
So
there's
what
no
is it?
harm.
Something glistening in the sun, like the cheek of a Chesterton. That was one of his. Um, but and I would maybe just I would love to polish up a few of them and bring it out as a collection called Panama Hats Collected Doggerel.
Mm,
Um, and I think what one of the pieces I've been drafting in that is called "I Don't Want to Be a Poster," which is written to the tune of the old Trooper song "I Don't Want to Join the Army." Right. It still has a long way to go, but I would love to get it finished in the next couple of days and post it as a retweet to what Prudential has said. Because it's I think it's a good sentiment. I'd love to get people away from this kind of this addiction to being a poster where everything is dictated by, well, can I boil this down into a take, and how many likes is this going to get me, because one, that's extremely bugmanish of people, and it's also rather feminine, this kind of performative social thing.
mm.
I
I mean,
don't think we should be behaving like that.
I think how much time I've wasted on Twitter, and it makes me want to weep. I mean, do you want to be, you know, like in your deathbed and look back and think,
If
for the
only
last,
I could have tweeted more.
yeah, I mean, that's just that's something that's so horrific. You don't even want to contemplate it.
Also,
So I need to lead a sort of exodus away.
my thought whenever I see people just spending all day on Twitter, of all, even I won't name names, but certain people who call themselves world class scholars, right, but haven't read certain fundamental texts, and it's like, right, you've had how many years or months now of just posting on Twitter endlessly and doing one thing one day and 1 minute another thing the next and forgetting about it, and it's like, well, think of all the things that you could have read or appreciated or done in that time, because ultimately, yeah, you're getting some kind of dopamine hit from tweeting about this or that, and yeah, some of it is important, sure, but it's also not. It's also very ephemeral and very temporary, because it's draining your attention span at a rate of gallons.
Mm.
You're going to be going on about based philosopher of the week, and then 2 weeks later you'll be talking about a hot button news issue of the week. I think we can really comport ourselves better in these circles.
Yeah, and you don't want to take pride in constantly jumping from book to book. I think
No,
that's something that I speak with Bohm Respector about. And
yes, our good friend.
he's totally right when he says it's more profitable in a year. Say instead of reading 100 books
Yep,
badly, read one book really well.
yep,
Sit with it. Read
yep.
it once you've finished it. Read it again, and you will get more out of that than reading a bunch of diffuse stuff. That's
I
the problem with
I would
people today. They're too diffuse.
I would go as
They're not
far.
focused.
I would go as far to say, as somebody who posts on Substack infrequently, And as somebody who reads all the Substack blogs, and yeah, there are good things on there, but I would take that comment a bit further, and I would say that I would rather people in this community read 30 pages of Proust in a year than all the Substack blogs in the world. Basically, I mean,
except my
except
Substack.
Columbus. You should read Columbus, and of course, you should watch this channel. That you should absolutely do that. But one of the I have to say, I mean, it's a bit sad, really, but one of my proudest moments of recent times was I was on someone's stream. I think it was a UO or something on it. It was Academic Agents channel, and someone left a super chat saying, this is my based reading list for the next year. I'm gonna do all these books. I'm gonna each month. I'm gonna read. I'm gonna read this and I'm gonna read this, and it was And I remember saying, like, look, there's no point forcing yourself through this list of books just because some like slightly conservative poster told you that these are based books to read or whatever. I was like, just go to a bookshop or something, or just go just like browse, just find something that actually interests you, that you derive pleasure from, and read it, and set time aside to read and to engage with these things. It's I think, like our friend Bone Respector, says, it's like you'd be better off just spending time on one book that really, really has significance for you, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with being based or political or anything like this. Just engage with it. Most people in this community are quite young. Use your time to just engage with the canon, with Western literature, with Western art, with Western philosophy, or anything like this, in a way that just you derive pleasure from. Don't force yourself through I don't know, like the complete works of Evelyn or something, just just for the sake of it. And just I'm somebody that has read an awful lot of Evelyn and has got a lot of out of it. But just because someone tells you, oh, it's based, that's not good enough. It isn't good enough if you're going to build up a mind that can seriously engage with literature and with art. That isn't a good enough criteria to begin with.
And if you're hampering yourself with moral questions as well, again, I'm not saying you should be immoral, but one thing that I would say is, I can't remember when it was exactly. I think it was last year. I posted an excerpt from a Rimbaud poem, and somebody in the comments is saying something like, "Oh, but don't you know that he was like fucking Verlaine, and they're like total degenerates." I'm like, yes, I know that they were absolute degenerates. Have you read the poetry?
Exactly.
I mean,
it's two different questions.
Or say Thomas Mann, right, who was
Yeah.
anti-Nazi and obviously wrote Death in Venice, which is a pretty scurrilous book, right? But
undoubtedly one of the greatest novelists who ever lived. There's no
it's like,
question.
well, you're telling me because of these political beliefs, because of his personal let's say eccentricities, probably not a strong enough word. You're telling me I can't read The Magic Mountain, which is one of the greatest novels ever written. It's a sublime book. I mean, my point is, you if you do that, you are closing yourself off to so much, and for what purpose?
Well, it's again. Are you somebody who genuinely cares about the fate of the West and the art and the literature that has been produced by the West thus far, or are you in this purely so that your friends will think that you're cool and based? Answer truthfully. Like, be real. What are you in this for? Basically, was the question that needs to be asked. I mean, like you said, there'll always be some smarmy poster who will be like, well, don't you know that Thomas Mann wrote these questionable things or whatever. But it's, as you say, it's, well, I'm sorry, it's terrible. It's like how if you had to, like, or if you said to me, I want you to do a 3-day long charity rant on everything you hate about Pablo Neruda, right? I could do that, no sweat. I could sit here and talk for weeks about all the things I hate about Pablo Neruda. The fact is that I still admire his poetry. Look at someone like Polanski. Disgusting pedophile, made some very interesting films. This is a completely unrelated point, really, to what the rest of it is, but it's still worth saying.
I mean, and again, I think a lot of this might come back to the point that people think that art is inherently connected to someone's personality, their personality in day-to-day life, what they get up to. And that might be true to some extent, but I think and this is what, Eliot argues this in a later point in that essay. He says, the more art approaches something sublime, the more art is true art, the more impersonal it is. And this is something that I think is very counterintuitive to a lot of people today, because they don't think that way. They think that art is just a record of someone's unique subjective experience, but it's not. Your great art is the artist is separating himself and trying to look on things objectively and trying to look at things through the lens of art.
It's like again, very personal point. It's very very sort of it's not really strictly related to Eliot as such, but since being interested in poetry and having people I know kind of think, oh, this, he's a guy that knows about poetry or whatever. There's a kind of pastime among people who know me, which is to show me like some woman's Instagram poem or something.
Oh, yeah, I get that too.
Or like, oh, this is look at this thing that Rupi Kaur wrote,
or Destiny Bird's song.
Yeah, because it's like, and it's the enjoyment is, well, let's get somebody who we know will hate this to react to it, and it's like, what they don't understand is that it's not. I don't hate it because it's like paused or left wing or not based or whatever. I hate it because it's not even poetry. Yeah. Because it's not actually something like, there is bad poetry, like I mean a fellow Scot, William Topaz McGonagall, right? I mean, I have a very cheap Amazon print copy of all his work, and it's very entertaining because he wasn't just bad; he was like amazingly bad, right? But he was at least trying to write poetry, whereas a lot of these postmodern, like whatever, like queer, black, intersectional, gender poets, like, it's not actually poetry. They're not even approaching the art form, really. They're just putting words down. And this is an important thing to note, is that the hatred for a lot of the pause that we see in modern art isn't actually, it's a lot of the hate that we have to have for it, the legitimate hate, is because it's not actually art. It's not actually connecting on that level.
You see, again, this comes back to the importance of criticism, right? If you want to, there is this sort of movement that's growing of trying to break into the art world, the scene or whatever. And I think that's an admirable goal. I think it's certainly better than sitting complaining on Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you're going to attack Rupi Kaur, if you're going to try and tear down this false poetry that exists, people are just going to look at you as a crass idiot if you're saying, "Oh, this is disgusting because it's about her and, I don't know, her lesbian lover, or getting
having periods,
or periods or whatever." You need to be trained in criticism. You need to be able to look at these things and take them apart from the perspective of poetry and show why it's bad art.
This is
then you will get somewhere. Or at least you've got far more of a chance of getting somewhere doing that than just moralizing, because they're just going to sneer at you.
I've said many times before that what the dissident right desperately needs, if it's going to have any importance or weight in the artistic spheres, is its own critical faculties, right? Yep. We need good critics a bit more than we need good artists right now, basically. We need people who are competent to judge a work on its merits, irrespective, and this sounds contradictory and a bit insane, but irrespective of its political merit to either side in the struggle, because ultimately the only way that we will go forward in that sphere is if we're able to produce good art, because up to a certain level, good art cannot be ignored. You see, I mean, the politics of people like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or any of these people were unfashionable even back then. I mean, it wasn't easy to be a kind of Christian or Eurocentric reactionary, even in the 30s. All the fashionable liberal lefty critics attacked Eliot for writing the four quartets because they were so overtly Anglo-Catholic. I mean, George Orwell even was a major detractor of Eliot because he said, well, how dare Eliot, not be in our political camp. But the point is that if we aren't capable of judging art properly, and all we ever do is sit and go, this is bad because it's lefty and this is good because it's based and trad, we're never going to get anywhere. We will die having achieved nothing.
Yeah.
And we have to have a bit more discipline and quite a lot more sense in how we write about art, how we write about how we discuss it, and what exactly we say about it, and the method by which we say it. Because without that, we have no capital in that space. And believe me, it is easier than people assume to take that space somewhat by storm. You know, we only need a few good novelists, a few good poets, a few good painters to actually cause something of a storm in that section of, at least certainly here in Britain, in that section of the culture. Those organs, those papers, those outlets, those critics can be attacked in a way that will give us energy and give us initiative to go forward. And to anybody who is aspiring in this sphere, that is what I would say. It's, well, we have to concentrate our efforts. We have to aim not just to be dissident or to be right wing or any of this. We just have to be good.
Yeah.
We just have to create things that are worthy of taking a place in the canon.
So put away your, elegies to Goebbels and Himmler and and your paintings of, I don't know, the bunker in Berlin or whatever, and just give yourself a proper education. But anyway, I think I have to go. I think we've harangued enough.
I mean, I'm actually very happy with this because I think we got more to the heart of Eliot as an artist than simply just doing a kind of textual discussion of his works. Anyway, and as I think, as we said, there will definitely be a part 2 because we have to discuss the full quartets in more detail and his later career in more detail. This is on-air planning. This is very unprofessional. But are you free on Sunday?
I'm not sure. I might be working.
All right. Well, there'll be a stream sometime in the next few weeks.
There's another thing. People, the people are not. There's no rich old woman who has come to me yet. I have no patrons. So I have to go out, slave away, Panama Hat, break myself. The muses are weeping.
I mean, I do sympathize because I mean, hopefully I'll be able to shed myself of this come the new year. But if there's one piece of life advice I'm qualified to give at my relatively young age, it's this, young Columba. Never, ever, even when the financial wolves are at the door, never in your life even consider the possibility of becoming a conveyancing solicitor. All right? Don't do it. Don't do it. It's horrible. And I say that to everyone who's listening. Never do it. It's the worst thing you could possibly do. Don't ever become a conveyancing solicitor. I hate it. I'm almost tempted to become a Stalinist and abolish property, just so that there doesn't have to be any conveyancing solicitoring going on this earth. For God's sake, it's terrible, right? Oh.
Well, do you have any sort of? I mean, what do people do? People like shill things, don't they?
Well, I mean, if they're watching this, they're probably already subscribed. So
yeah, I guess so.
Well, go and follow Columba on Twitter and subscribe to his Substack.
Yeah, I've been posting poems of no more than 5 lines because.
But he's got some very biting gems coming out soon.
Oh yes, the gems.
Some biting satire. Yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. I give them my wholehearted backing in that respect. Yeah. So somebody in the chat asked, where do we find the streams on the Wasteland? If you just type in on YouTube academic agent the Wasteland, it'll come up. He wasn't on the stream, but it was on his channel.
Yeah. Those are good. Those are very good.
I was just thinking, is there a short Eliot poem we could read to close this out?
You could read Hysteria. That's one of my.
Well, I've got the complete poems in front of me. Okay, should we do Hysteria?
Yeah.
All right, 32, page 32. I'll go to it. Right, Hysteria. This is from the Proof Rock collection, published in 1917. Hysteria. As she laughed, I was aware of becoming involved in her laughter and being part of it, until her teeth were only accidental stars with a talent for squad drill. I was drawn in by short gasps, inhaled at each momentary recovery, lost finally in the dark caverns of her throat, bruised by the ripple of unseen muscles. An elderly waiter with trembling hands was hurriedly spreading a pink and white checked cloth over the rusty green iron table, saying, "If the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden, if the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden." I decided that if the shaking of her breasts could be stopped, some of the fragments of the afternoon might be collected, and I concentrated my attention with careful subtlety to this end.
It's so good. Yeah, see, if we could get someone to write something like that, we're quids in, mate. That's the
Come
move.
on. Come on. We need more. Anyway, thank you
Well,
very much for tuning into this stream. Thank you very much, Columba, for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
it's
And
been
I
a
can
laugh
assure
ride.
the audience that assuming we have the time, there will be more of these streams to follow. People the last stream on this channel was episode 1 of the Sunday Ramble, because I do have ambitions to become a kind of Radio 4 for the kind of bass community, if that makes sense.
We should when I come to Groip, Wales, we should have we need a studio. That's what we need.
We should. Oh yes, we should mention. Hopefully, Columba will come down to stay with me soon, because poets need to collaborate more than anything.
Yes.
So perhaps while he's here, we could do some streams of just from one microphone, so to speak.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah.
Well, again, we're doing this on air. I mean, we may as well do this privately, but I've been thinking recently of, well, how are we going to plan the days, because we need discipline if we're gonna get work done. So I was thinking we get up at like 8:00, 8:30, morning ablutions, whatever. We work until 1 or 2 in the afternoon, just like in separate rooms, like locked away, just work, right? And then just pub, right? Just pub at like 2, right? And then pub until like 6, and then dinner, and then whatever with the evening, right? That's what I'm thinking, that we do that for just 2 months, basically, just like day to day.
I think we could get something
And
done.
we have to go to church on Sunday. We just have to. Yeah. Are you opposed to going to a Catholic mass?
No, I'm not opposed.
All right,
no.
brilliant. All right, well, we that's sorted then. All right. All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully there'll be more videos, proper scripted videos from me soon. I'm thinking of starting a second channel as well for just kind of unrelated stuff. Again, as I said, please go and subscribe to Columba's Substack and Twitter. I will link those in the description later on. And it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me. We'll do it again soon.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Shanti, shanti, shanti.